Hey guys, welcome to the channel. As you see in the thumbnail, what if Ichigo neglected by Soul Society and met Bambietta Part 1. Before I start, please do support for more awesome content, and subscribe my channel and like this video. Go support and follow the Relo for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story. Link in the description. Let's start this video. Was just a regular day. He had woken up early, had eaten his breakfast, and attended his karate class. As always, he had lost the sparring match to the local bully, a girl who enjoyed karate even more than he did. The session eventually ended, and his mother had come to pick him up. The two planned to go on a walk the moment they got back home. She did not want to awake her other children, as they rarely slept during the day. He wore his heavy winter clothing and was eager to go out. The two began their walk toward the outskirts of town. It was peaceful, and the weather wasn't too bad. They even trailed the nearby rural woodlands which led to the farmlands outside of the city. He was starting to wander off into his own direction, but she didn't seem to mind. Ichigo was too lost in own world to notice that time seems to move faster during this season. It was already dark, and he appears to have run off a bit too far ahead. The child hears a loud, strange sound. Something he has never heard before. Ichigo runs into the direction of the sound, hoping it would lead to his mother. He unfortunately got his wish. His eyes were wide open, but his mind couldn't comprehend what was happening. Ichigo stumbled back, but tripped and fell onto the ground. He was scared, lonely, and worried. Never before has he experienced such a troubling nightmare as bad as this one. His eyes were tightly closed and his face was buried deep into the ground. His arms shielded his head as tears strolled down into his face. What was happening was indescribable. There was this creature that was towering over Masaki Kurosaki. She had collapsed on the ground just in front of him. "Look at me," his mother said softly. Ichigo did as he was told and stared into her eyes. Only her eyes. He has never heard the words "it will be okay" as many times as he did now. Suddenly, the creature and his mother both moved. Ichigo felt something heavy leaping onto him. His body was pinned, but it was for a good reason. He could see from the orange strands that it was his mother. She was protecting from this monster, using the last of her energy to be a physical barrier between Ichigo and the hollow. He is only 8 years old. This entire ordeal had only been a few minutes. But to him, it was eternity. Being a child, he didn't understand anything. He couldn't even remember why he came over here in the first place. It wasn't his fault. He thought there was a girl standing by the river, and that she appeared to be close to falling in. So, to do the right thing, he attempted to save the girl. Masaki tried to escape, but it was a strong hollow. Much stronger than originally anticipated. She had believed that nothing could come against her since she longer possessed any attractive Ryuryoku. The mother had lost most of her powers in the past, but possessed enough to defend herself. However, something had happened just before seeing the hollow. A mysterious yellow light which beamed from the sky and engulfed her. Physically, she appeared okay. But that had to be quickly forgotten due to the mistake Ichigo was running into. Her plan was to get her child, and run away. Even without powers, she knew how to fight. Things were difficult, but a new presence sent chills up her spine. It was not the feeling of a hollow or a shinigami. It was something else. She was still alive when the hollow made an agonizing scream. Its body had disappeared, but the danger grew even larger. She knew what had appeared above her, but refused to turn around. It was too difficult to comprehend or believe. To think such a device had been able to block your blood from being tracked, you have promise. Yet, something must have happened to you. Masaki Kurosaki kept her son hidden, but slowly turned her head around. Every Quincy in existence knew what type of man was above her. "Your life will benefit me as you no longer seem to care about being a Quincy. I will gladly take more than whatever power you still may possess." She froze and watched as a yellow light lifted her into the air. The mother was paralyzed, and she could literally feel the light consuming her life energy and transferring it to the man. This power had been used on her before, but somehow, she was able to survive it. The body collapsed onto the ground. She was dead. Yawatch stood for a moment as the body of his lifeless victim had fallen onto the grass. The man had an irritation for Quincy who have abandoned their historical roots. However, she was still a pure-blooded Quincy, but not one strong enough for his purposes. Her life energy was more important. In the corner of his eye, he could see something fidget. "Gemished," he uttered with distaste. It only took a glance for him to tell what type of person was before him. To this man, Quincy came in two formers: pure bloods, who tended to be stronger, or mixed bloods, who tended to be less committed to their respective Quincy roots. Yawatch descended down and remove the body from the area. Child, open your eyes. The demand was absolute. Little Ichigo could not entirely comprehend what was happening before him. He already knows his mother is unconscious, but this could fit another nightmare setting. The child finally opened his eyes and was relieved to know that there was still light outside. The man who was looking down upon him wasn't nearly as terrifying as the beast he had seen earlier. But there was something off with this person. He had multiple pupils in his eyes, which seemed to be looking in every direction possible. Your spirit is unique and your Riryaku was already being revealed. That is how we were able to see that hollow. The child was struggling to breath, as if a massive amount of pressure was crushing his chest. Mons, he mumbled. The man assumes he was referring to the hollow which had nearly scared him to death. That monster is dead, as the same for the person whose remains are behind you. Yawach kept his eyes locked onto the child's soul. The king was a very curious individual. He had always been interested in seeing into people. Your future, I can see it, but you have so many options. So many paths. I have never seen another person with this many. I see a man with a regular life, a powerful tool used by others, or a leader. Perhaps, coming here was far better than I had anticipated. It was the horror movie he wanted to see at home but was too young. Blood. There were lots of it on the hill. Ichigo looked down to see his hands were covered in it, and it wasn't even his own. Although relieved that the hollow is dead, his mind is too fragile to comprehend the death of his mother. He assumed she was just unconscious. The concept of death has never affected him in the past. So why now? Fear has taken over. Just simple, natural, fear. You cannot give your powers, but you have a sense of uniqueness. You aren't designated to be with one. You have promise and a strong latent ability, just like me. I can see you becoming the biggest enemy, or the biggest ally I have ever come to know. Do not let this death decide how you determine your life, for this death will only make you stronger. But as unfortunate to you as it is, this came too early in your young life. I shall remove this time from you, and in a later stage I will use it to my own advantage to make you a stronger person. My son, do you understand what I am saying? He asked. Juhabak has met non-experienced children before. Yet, this one was too accustomed to a different style of life to even know what he truly is. You are special, and you are too valuable to be left here. Come, you will no longer be afraid of such creatures. Ichigo merely continued to stare into Yawacha's eyes. We must leave before they soon detect my power. I've overstayed my welcome, but I've seen what you are, and you will be a major stepping stone for peace. What is your name, Ichigo? He mumbled. Even if the man was a stranger, Ichigo had felt as if he had seen him before. He didn't get the feeling of worry, but rather comfort. Everything around him was disappearing before his eyes. The boy can't even remember where he is at. We will be going home, Ichigo. Live in the landscape and you will see it for yourself. Connect with others, as I will not always be at your side. This feeling. It was grass. Ichigo slowly opened his eyes and was blinded by the gray sky. He rolled over and quickly got up. There was this empty feeling inside. He couldn't recall what had happened, or even where he is. All around him were trees and more trees. It was a forest. A dense forest. Feeling no other options, he decided to simply go through it. The child had been in woods before, but usually accompanied by his family. But he can't seem to recall those memories. There were gaps in the name. A lack of names and faces. Whether or not it was a good idea, Yawach had removed majority of Ichigo's memories. Maybe it was to remove the intense trauma he had experienced, or to give him a fresh start in a new land. The Quincy Emperor only wished the best for his race, even if it meant sacrificing them for his own goals. He took the term all for one, and one for all into another direction. Juhabak has raised children his entire life, as he believed they were all his children since they all carried his own blood. He never once considered it kidnapping, or extortion of power, as all Quincy were his own. Their power was his, their lives were his, and their servitude into fighting for his goals was the ultimate belief he possesses. Ichigo stood behind a tree and scoured the area around him before locking onto a figure that was oddly punching and kicking multiple trees in the forest. The figure looked particularly furious and outright uncontrollable. He had fluffy red hair and green eyes. His attire consisted of sleeveless dark blue shirt with green pants and black boots. High-leg file! He yelled. Arrows slammed into the trees, causing them to fall down one by one. He leaped around, kicking and punching them until they collapsed. The boy was around 14 years old, and despite his age, looked well experienced and strong. The focus was drifting in and out, as if something was constantly bugging him. How can he just do that? How can after everything he can just walk away with no sign of anything ever fucking happening? I'll fucking get him. I'll fucking get the both of them. Why you go? That was our family, and you betrayed them. How can you be such a coward? That was your chance. Your only chance to slit his throat. We've been together forever. How can you betray me like that? My weak friend who I would have protected from that monster. How long has it been? How long has it been since you left, leaving me for dead back there? I still haven't gotten over it. And I never will. For as long as I live, I will remember you and him. I will never forget. Basby could not remove these types of thoughts from his mind. It was the most humiliating day of his life. He chooses to keep these memories and feelings as a way to never forget. To continue on with his original goal, and to never succumb to the blindness of false loyalty with power. The young teenager had just gotten done smashing a few trees and firing a few more arrows. It was his daily routine, and it got old pretty quickly. He has been trying to use advanced techniques, but not many targets to actually use them on. A tree collapsed, but Bez noticed something in the corner of his eyes. He investigated and noticed someone hiding behind the tree. A kid. A kid who was younger than himself. A kid wearing a large white coat and having rough, patchy orange hair. Quite a unique color. The fuck? How long was he there? Get the hell out of here, kid. If you died because of some fucking tree, I'll be in deep shit. How'd you do that? Proclaimed the child with a fascinated expression on his face. Baz scoffed. Kid, F off, alright? I'm trying to work on something. What are you trying to do? The child asked innocently. I was going to kill someone, but then the asshole who was supposed to help me left me for his side. Ichigo flinched due to the change of tone. He's never really heard someone yell so loudly about something he has no understanding of. The guy is a fucking monster, and we knew it. Yet He couldn't finish his sentence. Bez knew he was going crazy the moment he realized he was yelling his problems at someone who was around half his age. Monsters. Proclaimed the smaller child. He could recall seeing something along the lines of a described monster, but the remembrance could not click. Yeah, well, no shit. No one likes monsters. How the hell did you even get in that forest? Not many people make it back alive from there. Yhach. Ichigo had only heard the name once. And it was such a strange name that its pronunciation wasn't entirely there. Was that English I just heard? His name was Yawach. He said this was home, he mumbled. Baz's eyes jumped wide. Bach. He's still around? I haven't heard anything about that fucker in years. Where was he? I'll beat his ass. I don't know, he said he'd come see me when I was ready. Baz spat in annoyance. This kid didn't really seem to be all too bright in his eyes. He even looked too innocent to be an actual Quincy. This part of the world wasn't meant for kids like this. Baz sighed and began walking on the one path that led out of the forest. He could hear footsteps trailing his path. Can I come with you? Ichigo asked. The question surprised him. Sure, being alone wasn't fun, but Baz is skeptical. Considering what happened with his last partner, he stared into his innocent eyes and replied, no way, kid. You're too fruity. But I guess that's just a common thing around here. He trailed off and began the thought of having another subordinate at his side. It did make things a lot easier and a lot less lonely. Even if his goal was to kill, it was always fun to get into troubling situations with a comrade. Fine. But let me say some ground rules. Ichigo smiled and felt a sense of relief. First rule, no betraying the leader. I don't care what happens, but being a traitor is unforgivable and punishable by death. He nodded. Even though he has no idea what he was talking about. Second rule, don't be a fucking drag. Keep up with me in strength and we won't have a problem. Got it? He nodded again. I don't really like rules, so that's all that really matters. They call me King Baz. But since you're my first real subordinate, you can just call me Baz. Got it? He nodded once more. Well, what's your name, boy? Speak. Ichigo. He yelled profoundly. Baz grinned and fizzled with his hair. That's what I like to fucking hear. No bullshitting. You and I will be at the top, Ichigo. It had been a month since Ichigo started traveling with Bazby. The two would often visit small villages and seek out any odd jobs. Hunting was the biggest opportunity, and the two had become proficient at it. They were locally known as a fire duo due to both possessing colored hair resembling flames. Despite posing a somewhat threat, they were treated as weaklings by the elders. Even if Baz would threaten to fight them, they would scoff and call in the village guard. Ichigo was always eager to use his bow. It wasn't one that he created, rather, purchased from the market. The two had become familiar with traversing the huge forests which surrounded the landscape. Hunting wasn't much, but it was good enough for a child and a teenager to survive. All right, you see that little shit standing over there? Baz whispered. Ichigo closed his left eye and nodded. He pulled back the string and aimed it lower. The two kept their eyes locked onto an idle deer which was peacefully strolling around a thin river bank. Deer were very cautious animals and kept their distance from anything that breathed. Deer is like fucking gold in this part. Just aim for the neck. Ichigo blocked out all sound and remained still. He was kneeling and turned his bow into a diagonal formation. Unlike Baz, Ichigo had a regular styled bow, while the older Quincy wielded a crossbow. And the younger Quincy seemed to be more comfortable firing from a longer distance rather than a more confrontational shot. The arrow was released, and it traveled at high speeds. Unfortunately, the deer had raised its head just as the arrow was approaching. The sound of an oncoming object startled the animal and caused it to suddenly go amok. "Get that fucker!" Baz roared. He pulled his crossbow and began shooting multiple holy arrows. The deer rushed through the forest as it knew its life was in danger. Baz used his quick speed to try and chase the animal, but the forest confused him. He continuously cursed himself as his prey was escaping. The teen couldn't let the animal leave his gaze. If he even blinked, it would vanish. His speed was increasing, and the momentum continued, until it didn't. Slam! Bazby collided with a tree. His body slowly but surely falling down to the ground. God damn it, we really needed that. It hurt to get up, but the Quincy did it anyways. The teen shrugged but soon flinched as something heavy shot right above his head. Baz looks with amazement as an arrow trailed with strange black flames shot straight through the forest. Ichigo! What was that? He yelled in excitement. Baz observed the corpse of the deer who had the arrow stuck within its neck. A clean blind shot. Good fucking shit. Ichigo rushed behind his companion and stared in awe. Wow, Baz, that was all you? He replied. The orange-haired child flinched in surprise. Heh? I just got afraid when you yelled and I shot. Baz laughed and grabbed the deer by its back legs. Who cares, let's go to town with this shit. This wasn't like any town they were used to. It was a large city with a growing population and a hub for trade. To Ichigo, this was amazing. His memories have just been of small towns and rural farms. Urban zones were extremely rare and feared upon by the rest of the Lichtracht. This combination of wealth and people created power. Power was important. Power created order. It created stability. It created civilization. Baz grinned from the jealous eyes, which never left their prey. People who lived within this large town led relatively safe lives. They themselves do not go out and do the dirty work, as it is dangerous. So, food, more importantly lavish foods such as high-quality meats, were valuable. This was a place for children to grow up. There were boys and girls of all ages who were taught how to live in this world. There was schooling, housing, and places for people to simply live safely. But Bazby thought it was just a society trying to keep him down. He never liked the rules of following laws and being kind to one another. Growing up fighting was what he was used to, and seeing so many other people his age do the exact opposite made him feel at odds with himself. It was as if many of them were against him in a way. The red-haired Quincy grinned and eyed a couple of girls who took notice of their prize. You see all these girls here, Ichigo? They're all mine because I'm the king. He added, but you can have the weird ones. Ichigo smiled. Thanks, Baz, he said happily. The boy had no concern for the opposite gender. They finally arrived at the butcher's kiosk and slammed the creature onto the table. The butcher smirked and offered Baz a relatively good amount of gold for the carcass. It was enough meat to serve a family for days. The two split the profits, but Baz of course makes sure to hold on to the money as Ichigo had no idea what to do with it. Regardless of his age, the older Quincy knew how to spend money. Food, clothes, a place to sleep, he was very mature for his age. And he wasn't selfish either. Ichigo was more of a friend than an actual subordinate. Ah, how cute! Ichigo heard the voice and turned around. Looking down at him was a tall female with long, straight black hair. She was wearing stockings and a white sweater which complemented her wicked blue eyes. Her smile made him feel comfortable, since it's the same type of smile an old family member would give him. She came closer and placed her hands onto his face. Aren't you adorable? Bazby, however, noticed something off with her attire. It was a very familiar styled white military uniform. Compared to ones Baz has seen in the past, it was very basic. Step back, witch. The red-haired Quincy spat with lowered eyes. What a creepy fuck, her aura is hollow level, he said to himself. The female Quincy squinted her eyes and darted her attention toward Baz. And who the hell do you think you are? She replied in a creepily low tone. The voice startled the younger Quincy. He stepped back and calmed himself. Violence in the city was not tolerated. Anyone caught starting the altercation would be seen as the aggressor. Baz let Ichigo have his little moment with the girl. Turning around, he began to notice a pattern of figures. Wait, they are fucking everywhere, he said to himself. His eyes began wandering around as many white uniformed individuals made an appearance all over the city. But one person had caught his attention. One male Quincy with a feminine face changed the entire situation. Baz quickly discarded any reasonable thought he previously had. The man was walking toward the exit of the massive town. While his comrades were remaining idle, a ferocious smirk formed on the teenage Quincy's face. He grabbed Ichigo, who at the time was still being coddled by the wicked female. Bye, the girl said. Ichigo waved back and pulled himself from Baz, who was too focused on the figure ahead of them. He didn't bother asking, as an answer would only annoy his friend. The two eventually left the city, and began cautiously following someone. Baz and Ichigo crept through the forest like snakes. Not one sound was made during their quick travels as they planned to stalk the man known as Hubert. Hubert, the Wandenrake vice captain, is Yhwach's right-hand man. He had been in various battles fighting for whom he believed is the rightful ruler of the Lichtracht and emperor of all Quincy. The kids who were following him noticed that the man was alone in this empty camp. Baz checked around the perimeter to see if they were being followed into a trap, but couldn't notice anything unusual. The camp was placed on the base of a mountain which shielded the sun and created a dark, captive environment which was well hidden behind the trees. Ichigo and Baz were a fair distance away to ensure that he was alone, and was not approaching another regiment of Quincy. The red-haired Quincy smirked and pulled an item from his pocket. A small coin-shaped disc was tightly gripped into his palm. The teen appeared from the woods and launched the small item as far as he could. It was so small and insignificant that no one could hear it collapsing and breaking onto the ground. You're so fucking dead, Baz said to himself. Ichigo didn't know how Hubert and his friend knew each other, but could make an obvious assumption to say it wasn't a positive relationship. Little Ichigo didn't exactly know what Baz had just done. From the look of his face he seemed to be excited and eccentric. PSSH Baz, what was that? The younger child asked quietly. Shush, shut the fuck up, he whispered back. Ichigo rested on one leg and positioned his bow, and then it hit. Hubert had arrived at the camp and was surprised to see the sudden change of weather. It was normally overcast in this world, but out of nowhere, pitch-black clouds filled the sky above. The atmosphere became cold, and the sky turned black. A dark rip ringed through the ears of the three Quincy. They all widened their eyes in either shock or eagerness. Jillian-class hollow erupted through the garganta and descended toward the ground. Hubert didn't hesitate to draw his sword and begin slicing the weaker class beast to nothing. Meanwhile, Ichigo and Baz had planned to observe and strike when Hubert was occupied. However, they hadn't planned that Hubert could fight out the entire mass of the small hollow army. Roahal, the two Quincy flinch in shock as a menacing growl comes from behind. Ichigo quickly fled backwards but soon tripped on a root which caused him to be knocked off his feet. This hollow was not a Jillian class, it was perhaps a freshly evolved one into a weaker Ajuchas. It had a skull-like mask with portraying sharp teeth and a ferocious grin. They didn't need to hear it in order to know it was filled with hunger. The menacing claws were slashed downwards toward the defenseless Ichigo, who could only put his own arms in an attempt to shield himself. The orange-haired Quincy felt a tug on the back of his shirt, as he was lifted from his position and thrown far back. Baz pulled up his crossbow and launched multiple arrows into the hollow, who was furious that its meal had been taken. It was able to make one last scream before vanishing into the atmosphere. The Need noticed a strange purple and blue substance drain down his friend's arm. Shit poison, he said to himself. Come on, let's fuck him up. Ichigo nodded and stood back up. The two got back into position and made sure to keep a safer distance. They were taken completely off guard by the hollow, and if it wasn't for Baz and his quick thinking, Ichigo would be dead. Just a mere scratch was able to cause the younger Quincy to start shaking. But he knew that it wasn't the time to be complaining. This was his first real battle, and he had been eager to do it right. Hubert didn't care for such weak beings. He was the vice captain of the Stern Ritter, and had been used to battling the strongest fighters of the Soul Society. The two observed the older man and noticed how strange his power was. The vice captain never pulled out a bow. He had enjoyed using a sword for his preferred fighting weapon. To the Quincy name, it was contradictory to use a sword, especially when they were planning a war with the Shinigami. However, it was not blasphemy. People just had different preference toward fighting. It didn't take long until the military figure was able to deal with the hollows entirely. His attention turned towards the forest. You could have had the fight of your weak life if you had just remained in the city. Now Yhwach isn't here to protect you, kid, Baz snapped his eyes wide open and forced a smile. He sprung out of the forest with his arms open. What a coincidence. It's just a shame Yawach isn't here to die with you. The arrogance on both sides was alarming. Sure, Hubert had the upper hand, but Baz has already proven he is not afraid to utilize the most daring options. Hubert smirked. I should have brought that blonde kid. It would have amusing watching you two kill each other. The blade was drawn, and it was pointed towards the younger Quincy. He charged Rasher into his bow. That kid, you mean that kid who you serve? Baz roared before leaping toward Hubert at surprising speeds. The vice captain was forced to defend as the red-haired Quincy slammed his bow onto him as if it were a melee weapon. The comment stung into Hubert's ego and pissed him off. A point-blank arrow was shot, but the Wandenrake man dashed away. The team was alarmed by the speed and quickly flipped his position. He began shooting more arrows, but Hubert skillfully dodged them. Baz was barely able to escape a clean decapitation by just moments flipping his head back. Hubert was fast, and moving back would only be what he wanted. In order to dodge the attack, he had to be away from where the blade was striking, rather than simply moving backwards. Hubert complimented, I see you used that illegal bait to notice some of my abilities. You're not that bad. No words were made as concentration was the only thing which was filling the red-haired Quincy mind. Just one small mess up and he would be critically injured, or perhaps even worse. Hubert had beyond perfect strikes, which was just absurd. The strikes had yet to hit, but it was the amount of speed, force, and time it took to make one. Baz panicked as the superior Quincy appeared behind him. The vice captain elbowed the younger boy in the back, causing him to fall face forward. Slightly amused, Hubert took this sadistic opportunity to stab the fallen teenager. Aya! He yelled in agony as the sword had ripped right through his left leg. It had gone past the exit wound and deep into the ground. The teen smirked and, using his right hand, grabbed the sword as the vice captain tried pulling it back. You fucking idiot! Baz yelled. Hubert kicked the boy in the stomach and kept urging his sword to pull out from his leg. Using his left hand, Baz pointed his index finger at his opponent. There was no name for the technique, but a small gust of Rasher was shot from the tip of his finger, directly into Hubert's kneecap. Motherfucker! The Sternritter yelled. Soon he, too, had collapsed onto one knee from the intense pressure and pain. What the fuck was that? I destroyed his bow. The internal screams caused the man to loosen his sense. Now, almost instantaneously, a large blue arrow coated with a black aura was shot from the dense woods. Hubert turned to his side and widened his eyes. He tried gripping his blade but cursed as Baz had refused to release his grip. Standing was not an option either, as his kneecap had been ruptured. The vice captain closed his eyes and raised his Ryatsa levels to the fullest. Bounce! Hubert would have almost smiled if this hadn't been so humiliating for him. He watched as Ichigo was peeking out of the forest with his eyes widened in shock and confusion. He looked down at Baz and noticed the same thing. Using one of his legs, the older Quincy lifted himself up and faced Ichigo. The orange-haired Quincy was frozen in fear. He tried shooting more arrows but to no avail. Everything he shot simply bounced off of Hubert as if it was nothing. His Majesty gave me powers and now he says one day they will be given to that weak-ass fucking kid. This is my power, I earned it. The balance is my creation. His Majesty has no right to take it from me. You two have had good fortune recently, yes? Well, I fucking haven't. I guess this is compensation to not die to children. Ichigo watched as the man loomed above him. Time had appeared still, and his body began to shake. Hubert never went to collect his blade. Instead, he had simply formed another one and pointed it at the boy. The child did not even hear a word. All he could make out from what was happening was the large amounts of liquid which had shot out of his chest. The thought of this happening triggered many painful flashbacks, as well as the fear of dying. It was just like that time with the monster. He didn't want to die by a monster. He didn't want to die at all. But it hurt. Ichigo fell onto his back and could only see the overcast sky and Hubert. The man looked at him with a painful expression. It isn't every day he goes around killing kids. But today was clearly one of them, albeit it was Baz's idea to try and harm the man in the first place. A child has no concept of comprehension, especially at 8. But he was growing up fast. A slash across his chest, and a bite mark on his arm that was clearly going to be infected. This fear that he possessed, he did not know how to deal with it. His eyes remained staring at the sky, while the rest of his body was frozen. He could always show them. The monster, that is. It was morning, it was cold, it was cloudy. A typical day in the Lichtracht. Never any room for comfort. Brown eyes solely open and were immediately blinded by the intensive bright light. Ichigo sat up and felt an aching pain run throughout his body. After a few moments, he sits up and stretches his arms out. Getting up was never fun, but today he felt he had no other choice. At least he had slept in a comfortable bed. A nudge caused him to look down. A patch of wild black hair covered the majority of the large bed while he was stuck at the end. The previous night was a mess. Too complicated to think about right now. But at least it was a productive night. Ichigo smiled and ran his hands through his hair. He had a headache, but that wasn't a good enough excuse. It was dangerous for him to get out of the bed. Waking up the person next to him could lead to severe consequences. But it was his fault for being here in the first place. Luckily, he was a master of stealth and quickly slithered down to the ground. The door was cautiously creaked opened. Fortunately, it didn't make any loud obnoxious sounds. Ichigo looked over his shoulder, admiring his own capability. However, he quickly squirmed away just after noticing a pair of brown eyes slowly, but surely open. He walks through the fortress of Silburn as quickly as he can. Just the smallest sound could trigger any individual to come and give their inconvenience. Ichigo felt too many people lived in Silburn. He never had interest in talking to anyone during the morning. While he did respect and admire some of his comrades, a lot of them were simply obnoxious, sociopathic, or just not fun to talk to. The fortress was most definitely looked smaller from the outside. Inside it was a labyrinth. Then again, there was his power he could use to leave. Although, his power was something he enjoyed most people not knowing about, and there were certain rules to using it indoors. But Ichigo was speculated to be a favorite among Yawatch, which definitely made him feel like an outcast sometimes. He was tall, around 187 centimeters. He also had above-average length orange hair. He stood out, even for a member of the Wandenrake. The Quincy was wearing an average white uniform with a calf-length trench coat. It was tied to his waist by a white belt and was wearing a black, long-sleeved t-shirt underneath. This had been his own preferred outfit, even if some thought it was a bit old-fashioned. Black was also not a common color mixed in with the Quincy attire, as it represented the one thing all Quincy despise. You seem to be getting out a lot. The voice had stopped Ichigo in his steps. The irritation from hearing such a comment was enough to already put him in an annoyed mood. He looked over his shoulder, and kept lowered eyes at the person who scoffed at him. He had practically the same attire as Ichigo himself, except this person had shoulder-length blonde hair and green eyes. Yeah, I have things to do. Is it necessary to harass me every time I leave? The attitude which was given was daring. Your job is no longer to watch over me, but it must be such a hard habit to break. Regardless of the many friends he does have many non-friends. Borderline enemies. I find your lack of openness disturbing. You used to be eager to report to everyone. The many replied, and you used to be eager for me to succeed. Ichigo shot back. A moment of silence ran through the hallway. Tension began to rise as both started raising their power levels in hopes the other would just back down. Ichigo was not one to back down in these situations. He had learned many times that appeasement in this army cannot be an option, for appeasement only showed weakness in him. Blood, sweat, and strength had been the three ingredients which got him to where he was right now. A powerful title had been rewarded to him, and he could not have been happier. He was a Sternritter. This was the most elite unit ever formed in the history of the Quincy race. The power scaled so great it rivaled the strongest enemies in the world. He had not just obtained this rank through mercy. The commitment he gave into himself and his role in the empire never ceased to amaze the king, and he had always been noticed for it. People respected him, feared him, or always believed that they could beat him, even if they never decided to challenge Ichigo. This had been his life for quite some time, and he had grown up like this and never really questioned much of it. He had created certain bonds with certain people and had been committed to keeping those bonds. It was the only thing that kept him pushing. He respected the emperor, but never really was fanatical about it. Blind loyalty had never been one of his attributes, and strangely, this made him even more appreciated. Once he had gathered his own strength, he stopped admiring others and focused on his own goals. Yet not everyone saw this as a product for the Wandenrake as the words were described. If you're going to say something, just say it. Ichigo sharply demanded, but his fellow Sternritter kept silent. He was never known to provoke arguments, but always was cautious when it came to people. Passive aggressiveness was a strong trait in this man, and not many people enjoyed taking the attitude. I know that you are scared of me, Yugo. Sternritter raised an eyebrow. You're scared to fight me, you're scared that I'm going to take your rank. The green-eyed man widened his eyes as a black hand was placed over his shoulder. He darted his body in the opposite direction and staggered in surprise. Another hand grabbed his throat and launched him into the air. It wasn't long before the captain of the sternritter was seen being slammed through the thick walls of Silburn. Ichigo merely scoffed. I know it's you. That trick doesn't work on me anymore. It was inconceivable. Truly, it was a thought that could never have reached his mind. He stood in the shadow of a large tree and kept his eyes locked onto the ground. Isshin Kurosaki has had a rough couple of years. The Shinigami never brought his children to this place. They were far too young to comprehend what the loss of life truly feels like, and he does not look forward to the day where he will have to explain to them what had occurred. However, it would be good for him to have some closure. He has lost plenty of friends and family during his long life as a Shinigami, but having lost not just your wife, but your first child as well, left a permanent scar on his soul. At the time, Isshin did not have any powers. He was bound to not having due to controlling the hollowification Masaki had suffered through. He crushed his cigarette and placed it into his pocket. The man sat on one knee and placed his hands on the 2 gravestones which left their mark. As a fighter, he never believed that death could come to him in a way that wasn't battle, but he lost almost everything. Now, he truly felt the despair of weakness in himself. If Soul Society came right now, he and the rest of his family would be dead. A hand was placed upon his shoulder. He looked up and frowned at the sorrow glare that his friend gives him. Kane was never attacked. I don't know what happened, but I think it is something related to Masaki. Ryukin Ishida was just as devastated as Isshin. Both of their wives had both mysteriously died at similar times. His wife's death led the man to become restless, and he even refused to bury her at first, knowing full well the details of her death still had not yet been discovered. The man was a doctor and been accustomed to dealing with the human body, but not knowing how his wife died drove to him near insanity. She was with Yuria when it happened. All he remembers is that she collapsed and didn't get up, the man added. Kurosaki Isshin and his wife did not have many allies when they had gotten married. It was forbidden in Soul Society, and the Quincy practically shunned Masaki away from them. She was originally supposed to marry Ryukin, but had never thought so. But him, why him? He didn't even have Ririoka for it to get to him. Isshin trailed on about the death of his son. It was obvious to see how Masaki was killed. A hollow had entered the city long ago, and had been preying on innocent people who were attracted to the bait. No previous Shinigami had noticed the hollow as it was able to disguise itself and avoid easy detection. The ex-Shinigami never once thought about fighting hollows ever since he had entered normal human life. That was no longer his job in life. Isshin trusted Soul Society to send a protective number of regular Shinigami to deal with the hollows, but it was clear they were too busy to really care about the humans in the real world. He could only wonder what the current Shinigami of the city was doing. It's not like the job is somehow confusing. All they do for full-time work is fight the hollows who terrorize the city, but he couldn't hold a grudge against them. Isshin knew what it's like to guard a city from threats, and he knew how difficult it is to control everything when multiple targets attack at once. Even if that hollow was somewhat of an extraordinary phenomenon, Ichigo should have been spared. They couldn't find a body. They couldn't even trace the Ryatsu from going into Hueco Mundo. He just vanished. The words had shocked Ryukin. Masaki was assaulted and killed by this hollow, and her body was still recognizable to the point to see what had actually killed her. However, her child seemed to either have been consumed, or had actually vanished into thin air from this exact point, and that never made any sense to the people whose job it was to watch over the human world. If the boy had ran, then he should have been eventually found by travelers or radar. Ichigo would never leave his mom on the ground in pain, even if she had instructed him to run and to not stop. Isshin tried doing his own investigation as the police would never have found anything. They concluded she was attacked by a black bear, and that the child was taken with the bear. It would explain why it came out of the nearby woods. However, they could never explain the entire disappearance of the child. Isshin was an expert on hollows, and the fact that they would take Ichigo as a whole and not Masaki does not make sense to his own knowledge. I want them back, Isshin declared. It won't be easy, his friend replied. Ryukin knew what type of Shinigami his friend was. Surely, he is not one to be underestimated or mistaken for someone of a lesser capability. Even the Quincy knew back from when he was just a teenager that the captain was fearsome. Are you going to help me or not? The ex-captain shot back. Fine, but I don't know how. We'll have to talk to him. Isshin laughed. What? What's so bad about him? Ryukin sighed. He just gives me a headache. The candy shop in its magnificent glory stands before them. The lights were on, and the city was alive. They stood there and knocked on the door and stared at each other. Isshin smirked. What? This place is great, he said with an optimistic smile. Ryukin sighed and impatiently hit on the door a few more times. Isshin suddenly then rammed his foot into the door, causing one last massive sound to rupture through the building. The door was then swiftly opened. Oh ho, what a pleasant surprise! How long have you been out here? Should have just knocked. The two walked in with irritated expressions. Ishin-san, Ishida-san, how are you two? Urahara Kisuke asked as he closed the door behind them. The two did not respond. It was just too soon to answer it. I see you're both holding up. The two nodded and took a walk around the shop. Ryukin was always curious about the Shinigami. He never got the whole brief on who he was, or why he was no longer in Soul Society, but he had trusted the man. By saving Masaki, there was no other choice but to thank him. The two had briefly worked together beyond that, and if and when they did meet, it was always with Ishin, as he was the friend of Urahara. Ishin hadn't seen Urahara since before the incident. He was nothing but a legend, a man who was tried for the crimes against Soul Society and was banished. However, he was able to escape before his powers would be stripped from him. The black-haired man knew for the rest of his life he would need to depend on Urahara, and now he was here to try and end that reliance. I assume you know why I am here, he finally replied. Urahara sighed. I can see it. But I don't know. Central 46 had your Hakusui sealed up and destroyed. Normal Shinigami would have had their powers forever ruined by this. Under ordinary circumstances, a Shinigami with his Hakusui pierced could never become a Shinigami again. But luckily, you were able to meet Masaki before this happened. Ryukin intervened. You Shinigami and your aggressive laws. Ishin is a soul. It's not as if his Ryatsu has completely left from him. He can still see hollows. The ex-captain smirked. Yes, but when I bound Masaki and Ishin's soul, the transition turned Ishin into a half-human hybrid. Follow me, he ordered. The two shrugged and followed the captain down toward a center mat. The shop owner removed the mat, which revealed a long ladder that descended deep down below the shop. After rushing down to the area, all three arrived in the infamous underground room. It was no average room, for this was an enormous training ground which took, surprisingly, only one day and night using Soul Society technology to be built. The two had never been in the depths of the shop and were stunned to see such a massive area underneath it. Mine is bigger, Ishida declared. The two raised eyebrows at his random statement, and gave him strange expressions. He sighed and hung his head down in embarrassment. My underground arena, he mumbled. The other two males ignored the comment, and went back to discussing how Ishin's soul could work. If you are half-human, then it could be possible you possess the Chain of Fate. The Chain of Fate was a binding between souls and the human body. Ishin was no longer a pure soul which became a Shinigami. He had lost his powers, and sacrificed half of his soul to become a human. This was done to save Masaki, who sacrificed her half to appease the hollow which had infected her own soul. Now, this is very dang. Okay, let's just do this already, Ishin interrupted, his eye twitching. Urahara smiled at the interruption. He was wondering when the father of three would discard the warnings and go right for the action. You know I don't like these boring explanations. Ryukin sighed at Ishin's choice of words and brought out his white bow. Basbi sighed and collapsed onto the ground in exhaustion, his head resting on the grass as he began cursing himself. He watched as Hubert began limping towards him with lowered eyes. The man seemed to have been starting to lose his sanity, as fighting two children who barely knew how to shoot a bow was finally getting to his ego. He even went as far as to curse Yawich himself. In reality, the vice-captain knew what was going to happen to him eventually if he remained in the Wandenreich. He was no fool. He could figure it out easily, and just the thought of him having his powers taken and given to a powerless child irritated to him to the maddening point. My position is being taken over by some worthless kid, he mumbled in a low tone. The existence Hubert had lived was for the Quincy name. Never once in his life did he believe that he would be tossed aside, despite being such a massive contribution to the Empire. Did he not mean anything to Yawach? The question was clearly unheard of within the Wandenreich. Yawach most certainly treasured all of his soldiers equally, or, that is what they all wished to believe. Hubert had fought in the First War and managed to survive, something which was unheard of, as all but a few had actually lived through the horrors of that mess. But Yawach had not given up. He ordered the revival of his army almost immediately, even if all the experienced soldiers had been obliterated by the Shinigami. You're not as bad as I expected. Maybe if you had just been a good little kid, you could have made it into the Empire. Would have been interesting to how you would be able to serve His Majesty only to be tossed out for another. The last part was silently mumbled. The tone had sharpened. It was almost a disease, and the only cure was more blood at the end of his blade. Baz kept quiet and placed his left hand behind his back. A quick crossbow was formed and the team began resting upon it in hopes to surprise the oncoming target. You've only shortened my little time, but you were right. That kid is somehow superior to me, and I can't do shit about it. Maybe I'll give him a surprise after this, the older Quincy said. The red-haired teen was able to thrust himself over to the side and revealed his crossbow. The vice-captain of the Sternritter didn't even bother flinching as the holy arrows zipped right past him. Now amused, he wonders if that shot was even meant supposed for him. You're clearly not ambidextrous, Baz cursed in misfortune. It was true, the teen was right-handed and was trying to surprise the Sternritter a second time. However, his right hand had been crushed by Hubert just a few moments ago, and risking using a weak limb would have only limited his chances at landing a shot even further. With "Gaw!" Hubert quickly gripped his left arm and faced the opposite direction. His eyes suddenly lower onto the figure of a small child with orange hair and determined brown eyes. He had a victorious smirk on his face as the bleeding from the previous wound had stopped. Ichigo had been able to subconsciously activate his blood vein, which kept the wound from becoming too fatal. "I'll let you live, and you take the opportunity to shoot me in the back," he roared. It had been true. For whatever reason, Hubert had decided that simply slashing Ichigo across the chest was enough to keep him down. He had not decided to completely finish him off. Whether it was the morality, or perhaps just the way he did things, he had chosen not to kill Ichigo. "Are those flames?" he asked himself as the man painfully removed the arrow from his left shoulder. The arrow soon evaporated into thin air, along with mysterious black, flame-like material which came onto it like a comet trail. The Sternritter, without even looking, soon begins to quickly stomp on Basby like a placement mat. He yells in agony, but Hubert knew if he didn't end it quickly another shot would be coming at him. With one last kick, the vice-captain of the Sternritter slams his foot into his stomach, sending him rolling across the grass. Ichigo and Baz are now closer to each other, but too far to give medical assistance to one another. "You've pushed me, I'll give you that, but you are nothing special. You don't give powers, you don't steal them, and you most certainly aren't anything worth keeping. Why is that you are on such a prioritized list? You and that other fucking kid." His Majesty said this, he said that. His Majesty said to train this kid, serve him, and protect him with my life. Fuck it, I'm not worthless. Hubert raised his sword in the air and began stumbling toward Ichigo. The smaller Quincy narrowed eyes and began firing more distanced arrows, but the vice-captain was an expert swordsman who only scoffed at such sad attempts to hit him. The orange-haired child now widened his eyes in confusion as the older man was slicing the arrows directly in half despite coming at him through high speeds. Eventually Ichigo could no longer move further back and bumped into a tree from behind. Shots as close as they could be no longer even fazed the Sternritter. He only wished for Ichigo's blood to be on the other side that blade. Hubert raised his sword and pointed it at Ichigo, who was now panicking as the man stood before him like death itself. "You see this, Your Majesty? Do you see another mistake? What would you say to me right now?" Ichigo tried raising his bow in hopes of being able to stop the blade, but the man only grinned and threw the bow away. He would ask why in the world you are about to die to some kids. The feminine voice alerted the vice-captain into a state of frenzy. Getting caught like that by another familiar presence only fueled his pent-up anger even further. Before turning around, the man lifted his free leg in the air and rammed his foot into Ichigo's stomach. The trees made a domino pattern as the child was slammed into them with high levels of pressure. He turned around and stared down at the person. The figure was a young female, around age 16, with long black hair and dark blue eyes. She was wearing a white coat and black stockings. "What are you doing here, Sternritter Z?" Hubert asked in a dark tone. The man was known as the vice-captain of the entire organization, so his status among ranking was higher than her own. Not to mention he always had a dislike for the young female Quincy. She placed a finger on her mouth and stared up into the sky, as if mocking him in a goofy expression, "I just don't know. I guess I got bored." She replied with a happy tone. "I didn't really come along to be your little vanguard, girly boy." The insult was very common among the Wandenrake. From simple genetics, Hubert seemed to have a fairly feminine face despite having a very masculine personality and status among the ranks. It was something he has just been teased about his entire life. "I am your superior, go back to that city at once," he ordered. She performed a quick spin twirl dance, annoying him even further. No," she replied. "Just let that one go, and I'll leave you to your weird child-abusing fetish." Hubert no longer had any patience to deal with subordinate. "Then you must be punished. Don't forget your place. You only just recently got promoted to Sternritter," he yelled before fixating Reisher below his feet. Hubert formed a vicious smirk and used Terenkyaku to appear before the other Sternritter. Giselle merely crossed her arms and smiled in return. "Aogora!" The vice captain yelled in shock as someone else stopped his blade. This individual was another Sternritter and a friend of Hubert, so it doesn't make sense for him to be attacking the latter. However, something was off. He had a very noticeable scar on his forehead along with big lips and a large nose, but the most striking change in his appearance was the fact that he had gray-like skin that was patched all over his body. Algora blocked Hubert's sword with his own blade. Blind, the man uttered. The vice-captain of the Sternritter widened his eyes as a bright white light began forming around the area. Algora! What is the meaning of this? The cries of Hubert could never reach Algora's ears. Hubert kept clashing with the man. As the Grand Master of the Sternritter, I know your powers, girl. But I also know they shouldn't be working on another Quincy. So how? Erasure around the area began to emerge from the ground, its color changing from light blue to pure bright white. These particles then froze and began to connect to one another via erasure strings. I've seen this before, you witch! The vice-captain yelled. You believe using my subordinate's powers against me is somehow going to save yourself? The Quincy soon gripped his blade and began slashing through the white erasure at high speeds. Although he kept slashing, it did not look like he made much of an effect. The true power was the false sense of defeat that flew through his veins. Eventually, Hubert escaped the light and faced against the girl, who was just smiling away. I told you that one day you were going to be mine, she said with stars in her eyes. He had recalled such an event, but it was so creepy he had just decided to not even affiliate himself with her anymore. She was by far the youngest Sternritter of this generation, and by far the most obnoxious and strangest. Blood. It finally had come out. You creepy girl, His Majesty is watching us. He will dash. His Majesty! She yelled in laughter. Her eyes lowered. Who do you think told me to come with you? She spoke in a low tone. You dash! Hubert looked down, and was forced to spit out a red liquid as a blade had pierced him from behind. It was not Sternritter Z, or his friend Algora, but someone he had feared which would eventually come to get him. He could not sense this person, as his own script gave him a unique ability. Zydritz. He was another old friend who had fought in the First War. His skin was also gray, and his eyes patch was open. He's dead. He has to be dead. Like many other Sternritter powers, they do not work against other Quincy. There has to be an exception with the zombie, he said to himself before his body was forced to look at Giselle. Yep. It was hard fighting both of them, but they were so gullible. I finally have some new people in my collection. 3 powerful Quincy, what a start. 3. She will not get me. Hubert lowered his head down in defeat. The balance, it did not work because they were already dead. How can I tip the scales on dead men, he uttered to himself. I put too much faith into the power His Majesty had given to me. It was not godworthy, as the Schutzstaffel power is. It actually had flaws. My blood could not save me either. I've been fighting in this uniform my entire life, and here I am, dying to my own kind. Yawach, will you even brush more than a simple thought as to all 3 of us now, as we die? I suppose it is a lot better than you killing me with the Oswallen. I just hope you don't gain my power from this. Algora Zydritz, how could this have happened to you too, but for me to die like this? To this witch? She will not get away with it. She is a traitor, and will die a traitor's death. But I just wonder, is a traitor's death more noble than a sacrificial death? Answer me that, your almighty King God Emperor Yawach-sama. Tell me how the best death should go about. For we all swore to die in battle against the enemies of the Wandenreich. It appears you were the biggest threat to us all. Right, Your Majesty? After slapping him for around 5 minutes, Ichigo finally woke up and was relieved to see Baz. The moment Giselle entered the battle, the red-haired Quincy grabbed his friend and got the hell out of there. They were insane to believe they could actually kill the Grand Master of the Wandenreich. It was just a great fortune of luck that Giselle had, for whatever reason, decided to follow Hubert. Her plot to kill the man was an interesting turn. Almost immediately, the two dashed as far away as they could. Due to his leg injury, Baz was unable to run at normal speeds and was forced to gain assistance from Ichigo. The sun was eventually setting, and the two knew they would not be able to make it back to a safe haven anytime soon. They would be forced to sleep in the woods yet again. They only ever slept in the forest when they both went on scouting missions deep in the forest, but now was no time for contemplating. Exhaustion ran through both of them, and Ichigo had an open wound which was slowly being patched up through bandages and his own blood venae. One night and we'll head back, Ichigo said. Baz nodded in agreement. That was the same girl from back then, right? He asked with a hint of hysteria. It wasn't too long ago, but he couldn't forget same creepy girl who was only a few years older than him at the market. The same one which grabbed Ichigo for a few minutes while passively threatening Baz the moment he called her out. Yeah, she said earlier that we should leave the city. I guess she knew what we were up to. I mean, shit, I hope so. Either way, I remembered those fucking guys. Their names were Algora and Zydritz. They were there when Yawach did his little announcement. But shit, they're dead now. She fucking killed them. What an evil bitch. Ichigo shook his head. She saved us, so I don't really care what happened to them, his friend replied. Baz agreed and knew that their situation was dire before she arrived with her dead men. The two were completely exhausted and could only focus on resting now. Attacking Hubert might have been the most arrogant and irresponsible thing they had done yet, but they were only getting started. They noticed a faint smell in the air. It was bitter. The sky had patches of pitch blackness all emerging from one particular area on the ground. It didn't take a genius to understand what had happened. It was a fire. A very large fire. Bazby only stared with shock and horrifyingly memories of his childhood. All of his family members were burned in a fire. A fire caused by Yawach. The city, which they had gone to the previous day, was no more. It was that same city which was well-funded, well-guarded, and well-placed. That particular city was apparently a massive threat to someone, and that someone had to send his own army to deal with it. Everything was just bits of bone or, if not being tortured to the point where only certain parts of their body are considered fleshless, ash. This remembrance had fueled Baz once before, his own memories haunting him. It was pure coincidental that Ichigo and Baz had left when they did. But luckily they did. They would not have survived the absolute carnage that occurred here. We've got to take what we can get from it, he finally spoke. His friend looked over with horrified eyes. What? Huh, you scared of a little fire? Baz replied. Ichigo stared back into the city and simply followed as his friend led the way. He could catch on to Baz's rigid movements, knowing he must have had something like this happen many times in the past. Otherwise, he would have expected him to act in a similar to his own hot-headed self. Money, clothes, anything that wasn't burned to a crisp was valued. Luckily for them, no other scavengers had bothered even coming since the threat was so dangerous. The army had left after everything was dead. They had killed the shopkeepers, the guards, the governors, and even the poor children who were forced into combat against a much more professional army. Baz could predict how it happened. They just simply flooded the city with their own troops, and then had each soldier just start going at it like animals, burning and killing everything they saw without mercy. They were able to gather some supplies hidden within cellars of houses which were practically nothing but collapsed rocks. The two came back together and remained in the center of the city. Ichigo looked at a uniquely collapsed structure and approached cautiously. It's a water well. Was a water well. A public one too, Baz answered for him. The younger Quincy had a strange peeking interest as he stared down. It was dark, but he could make out some light since the roof of the well was now ripped off and displaced. Your cloak, it doesn't shield sunlight. Ichigo called out down into the depths of the well. Baz turned back around and approached the well on the opposite side of Ichigo. He could just barely make out a white color portraying from the shadows of the deep, dark well. Show yourself before we spray some arrows down, the older Quincy demanded. The figure below began to shake and quickly took off the cloak. They could tell the figure was not part of the same army, because why the hell would he stay here if the whole place was burning down? It was obvious this was just a sad person who had decided the only way to escape certain death was to jump down into the well. Ichigo threw down a long string of rope, hoping the person would catch the idea and decide to come out. It was the red-haired Quincy who was holding the rope, for he was stronger, but the sudden new force had thrown him from his position. His body began to be sucked down into the well as the individual started climbing up. Holy shit, how much do you fucking weigh? He yelled. Ichigo was forced to grab Baz by the legs and keep him from falling on his own. No response was given, but the curious boys kept their attention downwards to see what was actually coming up to them. The two could only make a large pinkish-reddish blob approaching them from below. Grab my hand, Baz instructed. The person looked up and quickly gripped onto his left hand. Baz cursed once more. Your grip is tight, way too damn tight. He was lucky the individual wasn't gripping onto his already destroyed limb. Eventually, Ichigo managed to pull his friend back, causing the rescued person to follow suit. The person they had saved was not a man, as they predicted, but a young, shaken female who was spectacle of her saviors. She had a slender build, light pink hair, and attractive green eyes. The girl was also around the same height and age as Baz. I don't weigh much, she finally spoke. I'm just a bit strong for you. Baz didn't have the energy to come up with a response. The girl took notice of Ichigo and held out her hand. Thanks for helping me, she quietly mumbled. He didn't feel the need to shake her hand for his own safety. My name is Meninus, Kurosa. We don't really care, but that'll cost you a bit, Baz finally said, motioning to the well in his hand. Ichigo was taken a bit back from the charge. Sure, doing requests at one's expense was just a job, but he had hoped to merely help the person who was in dire need. Plus, this person was around their age, not some old adult who could care less about them at all. Meninus stared at the ground and seemed to be lost in thought. I don't have anything anymore. The tone was going sad, and Ichigo was starting to feel sorry for the girl. It didn't hit instantly, knowing that her entire life had basically been annihilated in flames just before her eyes. He can only imagine who or what made her even fall into the well. Maybe it was her own quick thinking, perhaps her parents, a friend, or maybe even just a stranger who was trying to help. It set a depressing setting, and he couldn't feel anything but sorrow. Great. That's just fucking great, his friend yelled. I just love helping people who give nothing back. I love it. Ichigo gave one last nod to Meninus before catching up to his friend who was now walking away from the scene. He tried to plead with Baz, to just ignore the request for value, and hope to help her even further, but the older one did not seem to budge. That was just life for him. He had seen the same situation occur many times in the past, and not once did anyone really bother to help him out. Every point in his life he has always been on his own, and that made him a stronger individual overall. If that was to be cut, he would be forced to start relying on others. Baz scoffed off the request and concluded it would be a waste of time. Ichigo was forced to give up and only continuously looked back to see her in the same spot. She had been watching them leave and wasn't really sure on what to do. Is she following us? Ichigo flinched when, suddenly, he could no longer see where the girl was. Where'd she go? A presence was felt from behind. The girl, Meninus, had used some strange flash technique and faced in front of Baz and remained still. I can fight with you if you wish, she said. Without even a word being said, she decided to prove her strength by ramming her entire fist into Baz. The oldest Quincy couldn't even utter a single word as his body was sent flying across the street. Ichigo decided not to participate. Maybe the older Quincy deserved it. There's nothing here anymore, can I come with you? I can show your friend how to fight, the young girl pleaded. Since Baz was now unconscious and very damaged, it was up to Ichigo to be the second in command, and since he held this new responsibility, he decided that the girl was an asset, and she would be very useful to the group. Of course, the young child answered with enthusiasm. Meninus' eyes soaked in water. It had just now hit her that truly everything was gone. Whatever life was here, was gone, destroyed, ignited, turned into ash. No one can know what she was feeling while being stuck in a well. Loneliness, despair, all at that tender young age. It wasn't really a difficult choice for him to make. He stood there with his hands in his pocket without a care in the world. The walls all around him had been, along with the occasional flooring and glassed windows. It would be embarrassing to report such an incident in order for everything to be repaired. He didn't exactly own the fortress. Rather, he seemed to just be living in it. He wasn't one to normally go around and start smashing things in anger, and to be fair, this wasn't exactly the same type of situation. It had just been a simple brawl which escalated into something much more unexpected. Ichigo was never known to just start fights, although he did enjoy doing so if someone wished to spar or train with him, and it was always the same people who he had to go up against. No one new came along, and that is when Ichigo started to get bored with his comrades. He was not bloodthirsty, but he did wish to sway people into at least training rather than a one-on-one fight. As the latter is forbidden, the loophole being is that everyone can train together. But Yawach held his rules in high regard, and not many wished to even get close to disobeying. No one had this up to the highest extent other than Jugram Hashwalth. The captain of the Sternritter was in charge of keeping order and enforcing the biggest laws in the Vandenrake. Fighting between Sternritter was absolutely not tolerated, and he was the one who was always watching. Ichigo, like most battle-hungry Sternritter, had been very curious of the second in command. No one had ever been able to battle him in the past, and the urge to see what he could do drove others crazy. It was supposed to be simply nothing, as he had not hoped the balance would freak out over a simple clash. It wasn't as if he was planning to go all out. Ichigo couldn't believe what he had just done. Grabbing the second in command by the throat and assaulting him was certainly something that couldn't be tolerated, although he personally did not see it as such a big deal. The event had given mixed feelings, until he had learned the truth. The person that he attacked had suddenly vanished when he pursued him through the collapsed walls. You have become rapacious, said a voice in the air. The tone was high and snarky. What if I had actually been him? His Majesty would not have approved. The voice began coming closer and closer to Ichigo as he awaits the figure. His eyes were filled with a nonchalant expression. He could only hang his head in embarrassment to have been fooled. The figure seemed to have been appearing through the erasure in the air. Red eyes, young features, blonde hair, and an average Sternritter uniform with a hood. He was Sternritter V, for the visionary. A very arrogant and cocky Quincy, his power was forced to be admitted by many as godlike. Although seemingly a child, many have gotten the idea that due to the way he acts, he must be much older. "What are you even doing here?" he asked with a smirk. The child had impersonated Hashwalth, and knew it would irritate Ichigo. Gremmy Thumos was an enigma within the Vandenrake. He had been here long before Ichigo had arrived, and never truly had a history which he shared. Aging was never a process for him. Only Yawatch and some older Sternritter had been around the day he joined, and they never witnessed him grow up as all the other Quincy had. He did not have many friends. In fact, it is fair to say many see him as an annoyance. Ichigo had been the only person to ever actually tolerate his presence. The two had history together, many battles and events which even Ichigo was afraid to be at. But the visionary had always been interested in Ichigo as well. Needless to say, he was the only friend Gremmy could really consider. "Shut up, and just fix the walls," Ichigo finally replied. His weapons faded back into invisible erasure. And why the hell he didn't even bother finishing the sentence. Dealing with the child always got him nowhere. Just because you got promoted doesn't mean you can harm the second-in-command or other Sternritter. The V said back. "Relax, alright? I thought he wanted to go at it. I wasn't even really trying," the orange-haired Quincy said. He watched as Gremmy closed his eyes and began formulating his power. Before the two knew it, an idle figure of Jugram Hashwalth stood before them. His appearance and Ryatsu felt the exact same. Ichigo never ceased to be amazed at such a strange and unique power. He watched as the walls before him slowly began to fix themselves. The debris all began to vanish along with the shattered glass. "You're lecturing me on rules?" Gremmy threw his hood onto his head and grinned. "Don't get upset. You and I are different here. I only come to chat with you." He darted his eyes. "You couldn't have just asked me some other time?" The visionary sighed. "You're either doing some weird things with the loud one or you are with that other girl. You see, you and I get it. Not many others here do." Ichigo sighed and opened the lost entrance door which led outside the fortress. The child smiled and walked alongside him. It is not as if his fellow Quincy could stop him. The doors opened and the two were last seen entering the frozen barren wasteland as the fog covered their disappearance. Silbern was in a general sense was the shadow of the much more warm and enjoyable soul society which it cast from. The two however knew nothing ever lived past Silbern. It was not an area filled with mysterious creatures or areas of the divine unknown. In order to gain a good distance away from being watched by the captain of the Sternritter and his informants, the two had to have gone out very far. This wasn't necessarily an issue as Ichigo could simply travel at very high speeds while Gremmy could just imagine himself deep ahead. "We're far enough," he said while looking back. The fog had begun to intensify while Ichigo raised his Ryatsu on high enough levels to disperse the mist. Eventually the area had become clear and more open to the two. "How do you know?" "I imagined it." Such words left a blank expression on his face. He could never get over the fact on how ridiculous hearing that was. Ichigo stood and waited for his training opponent to make his move. Attacking Gremmy first was never a good choice, as all defensive methods would prevent him from even being able to cut his skin. Sometimes it would happen at random, the attack that is. Whether it is a gunshot, or perhaps some imaginary people, it was always creative with this type of person. He never failed to disappoint. "What's taking so long?" Ichigo asked in impatience. Gremmy smirked and continuously laughed. "You won't have much time to react. Let's just say it's in the sky." Ichigo gave a bored expression and decided to hear him out. By waving his hand, a gust of power dispersed the thick fog. It took a while for it to hit. Something out of the ordinary just did not sit well for him. He could ponder how the possibility of an event could even happen. Was this even real life? It felt like a dream as he looked into the sky. The laugh from his Sternritter did not help. In fact, it made him realize what he was staring at was in fact the real thing, and not some strange illusion. Godly itself could not fit the description. Of course, the fact that he could already create life, by definition he could be considered a god. But he was not Mother Nature, and that was something different than God. Mother Nature is not something that could be controlled. She is an autonomous state which did things on her own accord. He could not believe his eyes at the creation in the sky which he had produced. Ichigo was not sure on what weapon to pull out. Either way, He just needed enough power to destroy the newly formed object in the sky. Gremmy was such a pain. Apparently this was his new test which he tried pulling off. He gave the Sternritter V one last glare before pulling out his bow. It would take a lot to deal with this new creation. He could just only hope Gremmy wouldn't try to attack him in the process. What are you really? He sat down in the room with his right leg crossover onto the left, and rested his head onto his left hand. It would be too late to continue sleeping and he was too tired to continue training. Ichigo was forced to simply remain somewhere until time would call him again. Normally he wouldn't mind interacting with others, but from the morning his body was exhausted. Training with Gremmy was never a casual event. The child could simply either be at his fullest or his weakest in the matter of seconds. He could be facing a supernatural event, or a bunch of guns laced with razor bullets, which could fire at very high rates. Fighting against the visionary always gave a sense of what would you do in certain situations. It trained Ichigo on how he could handle a sudden different type of environment, or a new foe. Despite everyone having a unique style of fighting, adapting was the ultimate goal, and Gremmy had taken a joy at fighting Ichigo more than vice versa. Battling his Sternritter comrade gave the self-proclaimed strongest Sternritter a run for his own money. Anyone else who challenged him couldn't see a way to win, but the orange-haired Quincy had been notorious in being able to outwit and surprise even the most creative person among the Vandenrake. However, he as well has learned many tricks from fighting Ichigo. The two knew they couldn't be out for long, and they were forced to fall back to Silburn before anyone noticed how long they were really gone for. Ichigo was finally coming to his sense, and rested his eyes entirely. Naturally, a loud pounding sound came onto the door across the large room. He didn't bother getting up, only sighing as the door was forcefully opened by one figure with immense strength. He could only mentally prepare himself as 4 female Sternritter busted through the door. They all seemed to have different expressions towards him, as some did not expect to see him. "What a surprise!" said tall, well-endowed woman with green hair. Her eyes were blue and had eyebrows the shape of some sort of zapping thunderbolt design. She had a white hat and enjoyed wearing exposing clothing. Ichigo could never admit he liked the way she looked regardless of how true it was. It was just something strange to randomly say. "You who? I told you he'd be there," yelled another female. This one was shorter. She had long black hair with blue eyes and black stockings. This Quincy had been familiar with room in particular, and had often stayed. It was no surprise she had a feeling Ichigo would be here of all places rather than his own room, or rather doing some other assignment. It was no surprise another tall and very well endowed with pink hair and purple eyes said as she stares down towards her fellow female Sternritter. Unlike the rest of them, she seemed excited to see Ichigo rather than the others, who all were either complaining or upset. "You're such an idiot," mumbled the last female. She was by the far the shortest. She had blonde hair and a white cap with similar Sternritter attire as the others. And as always, food was the utmost importance. Eating practically anything was an essential part of her power, and couldn't go an hour without it. She seemed rather disappointed and not angry like the first female, for comments which made him rethink his decision to wait here. But of course he would have expected to be interrupted anywhere in Silburn. As long as he was in view of the Quincy in some way, they would always find a way to get to him. Whether he liked it or not. "What's the problem?" he asked with a calm tone. Having all 4 of them attacking him was relentless. "The problem is you're throwing your life away here." The girl's name was Candace Catnip. She had been a Sternritter by the time he had joined and was one of the first few he had met. Ichigo was not immediately promoted to a high rank. In fact, under orders by Jiaowuch himself, he was sent to try and learn from various Quincy on how to handle and balance his own power. The Thunderbolt was one of the first Sternritter he had worked with. Overall, he had gotten a good impression as long as he kept his cool and didn't fail to live up to expectations. There was much more history to the two, but Ichigo couldn't reminiscent in all. "Relax, I'm just waiting until she finishes her test," Ichigo replied. Candace gave a quick scoff. She didn't believe he knew how Bambietta truly was. Candy-chan is just mad because Ichi-chan isn't her subordinate anymore, and can't have any more fun with him. An immediate slap was initiated and the black-haired Quincy was sent flying across the room. Candace cursed the girl and asked if she was willing to die for such a comment. Giselle Gawel was her name. She had been the first ever Sternritter Ichigo had ever met. She seemed to be interesting at first. Over the years the two had become quite close, or as Ichigo thought they were. He had enjoyed going on certain missions and fighting certain foes together, especially if they weren't Quincy. The two had a very strange combo which seemed to have creeped majority of the Invisible Empire into assuming they were far more than just friends. Giselle was notorious for being a wild card by everyone, and putting Kurosaki Ichigo in the mix would only make things even more confusing. You're a slut, you know that? A dirty, disappointing slut. The word stung as he lowered his eyes onto the smallest Quincy. She shook her head in shame and was even embarrassed to be part of the same group of Quincy. Lil Tato Lampard was a Quincy Ichigo himself could relate to. They both were very observant, and aware of what was going on with the Empire, but the glutton did not approve of the situation going on right now. She would have much more to tell later on. Shut up. Why did she even want to do such a thing? Meninas McAllen was fairly calm and rational Quincy. She wasn't necessarily slow in the mind, but some would say she isn't that bright. The power never caused problems for Ichigo, and he always considered her a good friend ever since they had met long ago. Giselle's eyes sparkled as she hugged Ichigo from behind and smiled, because Ichi-chan did. Bambi-chan was so mad when he got promoted that she just went out and wanted it for herself. It's so cute, Candace said in annoyance. She wasn't surprised her fellow Quincy would do such a ridiculous thing. Meninas didn't seem to care, as she knew getting that high in the ranks would only mean more unnecessary work which she didn't look forward to. Lil Tato only kept weary of the situation. Why would a member of the Schutzstaffel even come to one of our lowly quarters? She asked. That is right. Kurosaki Ichigo had been placed under Yawacha's elite imperial force known as the Schutzstaffel. He had been promoted through unknown means, as Ichigo cannot exactly tell them why. For what they knew, Ichigo had a special mission around 2 years and that he was able to fulfill without failure. Apparently it was practically suicidal, and the fact that he along with 3 others were able to make it out alive proved their daring intent and will to complete their tasks. The power he had back then was even no match for what he had now. The rumors went around, saying he must have killed a high-level Shinigami or put down a massive rebellion. Either way, many tried to get answers one way or another. Stop lying. She wanted to be their way before I did. I just sort of got it without really knowing why. I was helping her anyways. I said I'd wait here when she was done. Candace snapped. All I'm saying is that I've been looking out for you for a while and now you just willingly want to die. He never really understood what she meant by words like that. Every time he would confront her about it, she would become defensive, suspicious of him for asking. I'm just sad they don't ever invite me or you to their training sessions, right, Candy-chan? Another slap commenced and Giselle was starting to get antsy. Being in this particular room as a man was very dangerous. That is why the Thunderbolt is so concerned and worried for his own sake. Although, it has been a while since she had made a mess in the room. Coincidentally, the messes had stopped happening the moment Ichigo had been promoted around the Vandenrake. But she never noticed that. She only could remember the horrific events that had occurred in the room. Aren't you all her friends? How could you doubt her so much? The 4 came silent as they pondered the thought of their self-proclaimed leader of the group. Honestly, they never really considered her a friend except maybe for Giselle. Although Giselle thought being a friend meant something much more different than most people did. In reality, they were never really friends. If she had been gravely wounded, it's more than likely none of them would do anything to help. But he did not know that. So what's on the test? Lil Tato asks. The silence had left an awkward feeling the air. And Ichigo was a bit spectacled that nobody had answered him. He never knew the background between most of them. What their history was, how they came to meet and how they all came to be. Either way, he never considered them to hate their self-proclaimed leader. I did not take it, but apparently it's ancient. Basically just a skill test and a psychological test. And how do you think she'll do? Many asked. Ichigo paused. It is no doubt that his female friend was one of the strongest Quincy in the Empire. He had learned of her power the first day the two had met, and ever since then he was fascinated with it. It was truly something special which had caught his eye. She caught his eye in many other ways as well, but this was one where he could openly show it. Let's go see. Closing his eyes, he finally stood up and surprised the 4. He began walking away. They all casually followed him in hopes of seeing the parts of Silbern which were restricted to them. Since Ichigo is part of the Schutzstaffel, he has absolute access to any part of the fortress given at any time. As they commenced down the massive halls, Ichigo felt a particular different stare as one of his friends had given him. He looks over and gives a familiar stare into Meninas. She gave a nod and he returned the gesture. It wasn't every day where he would get to hang out with his oldest female Sternritter friend. It gave him a nostalgic feeling as he remembered the days they first came together and had traveled before joining the Vandenrake. It had been around 3 months since the burnt city had collapsed onto itself. Many scavengers had tried to loot the area but were only disappointed to see that everything had been turned into ash. The area had actually become a massive bloodbath, Having so many people willing to kill for supplies just made the entire scene even worse. People had not reacted to the disaster in the way some would hope. Fear from the recently revived Vanenrake faction had spread across the land very quickly. People did believe Yawach was alive, but many of the older generation had kept the old tradition that he was weakened and his power would only come in the next few hundred years. Once again they were forced to travel among, and to see the forever flat and woodland environment. The girl had formally introduced herself as Menenius McAllen. She said she was born into the city through her two parents, who most likely perished along with everyone else. Strangely, it was her odd way of thinking which had led her to actual safety. Apparently, she had just fallen into the well rather than actually being set there down for safety. Ichigo thought it was ludicrous, while Baz had no problem believing such an event had occurred. Speaking of Baz, he was not happy with her deciding to tag along with them. Now there would be 3 mouths to feed, and nowhere to get easy money. He tried multiple times to kick her away, but she had brutal natural physical strength which always seemed to make him shut his mouth when he needed it. Ichigo did not mind the company. Having only Baz was just not as interesting or simply fun. Plus with 3 people their strength can now be safely rivaled by more powerful figures. Despite much protest, Baz eventually stopped trying to send her away. As he hated to admit it, she had some skills in which he didn't even know. Although very slow and basic, she had barely grasped the skill of her Enkyaku. Still, it is something which could have been very crucial for the two when they themselves were in danger or in need of gaining speed. Despite their tension, the two had one thing in common. It wasn't that they had very unique hair colors, but something much darker. The two had been victims of the Vandenrake's army. Yawach must have ordered the city to be razed into the ground. Its growing power was becoming a threat to his very powerful army. The army which Yawach had led, however, was not complete. He had amassed long ago the creation of the Sternritter, and only few made the intense combat requirements. No action for the future could be made unless his army was beyond complete. No one knew of his true goal, whether it was domination in the Quincy world or another war with the Shinigami. Menenius, I got a legitimate question for you, Baz said as he rested on a tree. She remained idle and gave him a questionable stare. Do you think before doing stupid shit? He asked with a hint of annoyance. You mean hesitate? I do not wait to be hit first if that is what you mean. Baz could barely make out words. That's not what I meant at all. She didn't even blink. I feel like you are going to hit me. Baz flinched and raised his hands in a defensive manner. No. Think for a moment, I'm not even near you. She hesitated for a moment and decided he was right. It wasn't always like this for her. Normally she would just assault him without word. This gave a very angry response, but he couldn't really fight back. She was not only physically stronger, but also faster. Ichigo only watched their scuffles and could only hope they would stop and focus on more important issues. They hadn't exactly found the safest jobs. It took a while to find another town with enough people that had enough to offer. Since they had no real particular skills, being guards was the only thing they could give for a service. Then again, their age didn't necessarily convince the employers either, so they were only paid very little and given basic housing. One thing Ichigo had forgotten about was his age. Although he did not know, his birthday had passed. He was now 10 years old and had grown quite considerably. He acted far older than most kids his age and was also more physically developed. Although it would be a while until he was entirely fully developed. It was at this time at being a guard when something traumatic had hit him personally. The village they defended was not in a very sparse and noticeable location, but it did have its fair share of attacks by other Quincy. During one of these rare events he had committed his first major jump in his fighting ability. He had killed someone for the first time. He had fired arrows at people such as Hubert with the intent to kill, but nothing ever hit. The person he shot barely had it coming. The person was just a regular white-cladded figure who was charging them along with at least 20 other fighters who were looking to raise and destroy the town. Ichigo, along with Baz, Menenius, and the other town guards, defended it with their lives. Ichigo had placed himself on a ledge outside the walls and was raining down arrows as quickly as he could. One particular person had caught his attention, which caused Ichigo to place his bow in a more stable position. He could see the look in the man's eyes as Ichigo's arrow shot through his chest. It was a dead center hit, and he didn't even know the man had died until much later. Of course, the thought of killing someone never seemed to actually bother him, but the action that had occurred left him confused and questioned in own morals. He had been taught ever since he arrived that killing meant protecting himself, or the people around him. His job was that, defending the people of the town from harm. It was the innocence of his title which kept him calm for a brief moment in time. However, soon things began to change. It started out as minor visions of seeing the look in his eyes. It soon followed by the rapid dreams which consumed him when he slept. This has done a great deal on his health. His focus on his duty as a guard had gotten lazy, and he was lucky Baz or Meninas could make sure he was always in check. Ichigo absolutely did not want to talk about it. His comrades had zero problems ending another person's life. Whether it be shooting them with an arrow or crushing them with brute strength, it was difficult to get over. Seeing that look in another person's eyes was heart-wrenching. He had not grown up as a killer, and taking a human life was never something that had clicked into his mind. It was not like killing an animal, or even with attempting to kill someone it was not the same as actually killing someone. The man was just like Ichigo, just another Quincy looking to survive. There were even scenarios that the three had thought of that instead of trying to reason with people, they would simply attack the town and loot it for themselves. Ichigo could have been quite possible the same type of person as the fellow Quincy he had killed. It was poisoning his mind, and he had not been open about it. People noticed this, and can assume he was just in shock from fighting. But two comrades knew he was being strange. Ichigo typically enjoyed talking and being social with them, but recently they had noticed he had been quiet and more willing to be alone. Meninas, now standing next to him, asked, "Are you okay, Ichi?" Ichi had been the nickname she decided to give him. Although Ichigo did not really like it, she seemed to enjoy saying it as it was much easier because of how it related to her own. "Yeah, Meni, just thinking," is all. She gave him a happy smile and ruffled his hair. It has grown quite a style. It was spiked up and grew to hanging near his neck. It was lucky for her that she had someone who wanted her there. Baz most certainly did not want her there, as he did not entirely understand what type of person she was. He just didn't get her goal and that irritated him. Not to mention it annoyed him how much Ichigo trusted her despite not knowing her at all. "Ichi Meni bwahahaha. You guys are such fruits." He couldn't believe how smoothly his body reacted when a fist was rammed into his face. The tree behind him collapsed as his body flew past it and crashed onto the ground. "Fuck you," was his response as he grasped his face in agony. "Quit crying, Ichigo. It's no big deal." He was right, it wasn't a big deal. Ichigo didn't consider it to be a big deal. He wanted the visions to go away, it was troubling. He knew it would have to happen again. Time would be the cure to his problem. It was always the fix to everything. As long as he remembered that he was fighting for each other's survival, everything would be fine in the end. Meninas or Baz seemed to never have a problem killing someone. It was strange. They were practically only within few years of age, so it was strange to see them not really care. Little did Ichigo know that this side of humanity had just been quite that. He was not a pure Quincy, but rather considered to be half-human as well. But strangely, Quincy are considered evolved humans with power to control Riryoku within them, and use Reisha for weapons. However, Ichigo has developed his personality from his human side. A Quincy or Shinigami could be cruel and inhumane all they want, but this childish innocence that he had possessed all came from the fact that he grew up in such a safe lifestyle. His parents, mainly his mother, had taught him manners and to respect others. Even if at first they did not respect him at times, these core values shaped him into the person he is now. Not much could change these values, as even if he did meet people whom he despised, there would always be those who liked him for the way he was. Currently Ichigo did not acknowledge what he technically was. Of course he would say he was a human, but he would just say he was also a Quincy and that there was not a difference. Yet things like this never bothered him. All that mattered to him and the people around him was that he could fight, and that is what proved to everyone that he was legit. He felt a hand wrap around him and the quick pull. "There's nothing to be sad about," she said with a concerned expression. Ichigo at this point had lost both of parents. His parents were not there to guide him, so he had no one to rely on. Baz was not to be considered one. He was more of that friend who only criticized rather than gives support. And that is just how he was a person. He never liked babysitting. Meninas, despite knowing him for only a short amount of time, had developed her own relationship. She looked down onto him as a friend. Maybe the reception he had gotten had made him feel better. It was comforting, knowing that someone cared. This was the type of connection and relationship which had been born and had lasted for years to come. She was around the same age as Baz. Being 14, it was a bit natural to her that she looked down at Ichigo as a little brother. She could only hope that one day he will come out of his innocent self and face the real world. She was impressed by the fact that he could fight as well as he could. He would appreciate the concern and support much later in life. Being from a normal, human life, having someone was just a daily part. But it has been around 2 years since he arrived, and he had not had the comfort of being hugged or told things will be alright in a long time. For Quincy laughed in amusement as one had delivered a strong zap to Ichigo. He flinched in literal shock and even staggered a bit to the side. He stepped over and kept his distance. A flustered expression filled his face with full of embarrassment. He hated getting shocked out of his memories. It's such a bad way to end them. Even if he had been only daydreaming for a few minutes. I thought you over that. His yells brought a nostalgic feeling back to Candace. Oh, how she reminisced in the fun memories of doing that on a daily basis. He was much more durable now and could withstand high levels of electricity. Only when he was not paying attention could she really get to him. The teasing was just the minor problems he had with the four. Many times it could get hostile, and usually he gets blamed for all the mishap. So, how are we going to fight in the invasion? Said Giselle as she grabbed the attention of everyone. I think we should stick together. One of the brighter ideas that Menelaus could give. She never liked fighting on her own and had preferred staying with her fellow female Quincy. That way we can all get ambushed by others. By others she mainly referred to specific Sternritter who posed an internal threat. Not many Quincy got along, and the thought of being attacked by supposed allies never left the minds of each other. The Sternritter had a very bad unity issue, and that was something Yawach knew and tried fixing. He felt it would be their own demise if they all could not work together. Fine, but if one of us goes off we're not going to look for you. Candace warned her friends that sticking together was probably the best option, and if they felt bold enough to fight someone, they had better not lose. Ah, that's not fair. Bambi-chan always likes to seek out good fights. Lil Tato spat. Good, maybe she'll learn something for once. Now, Ichigo knew that these four would never say such things when she was around. He had been with them in their little Quincy group to know the hierarchy and structure, meaning, everyone does what Sternritter says because she was the strongest. And he never had any interest in being the leader, since he liked being a part of it. There were more obvious reasons, but ironically they were the most blinding to him. Giselle smirked. Yeah, we should see how she does. Never did he believe what she had meant by that. Giselle has always been someone Ichigo liked in the Vandenrake. He never considered her an enemy or someone who messed with him. She was just like Menelaus in a way, except a lot more closer and upfront. She did not hesitate to do something which she wanted. Many troubling experiences had occurred from this. Ones he cannot seem to forget, but they were not all that bad. Too bad Red Boy over here can't come with us. Candace teased. She surprised him by placing herself in front, while smoothly placing her hands on his shoulder. Ichigo firmly defended himself by pushing her a bit back. Of course I'm going, he said. Can you stop looking at me like that? Lil Tato's gaze was starting to bother him. It wasn't an affectionate gaze, but rather one which made you feel uncomfortable. Slut, she said back. He didn't know why she was so upset. Normally she is very rational, especially with Ichigo since he too carried this trait, while practically majority of Sternritter did not have any trait of being that way. Everyone knows the Schutzstaffel has to stay by His Majesty's side. Ichigo merely scoffed. He and Yawach had a much more complicated situation than the organized way the Vandenrake normally works. He himself is an exception to practically everything. The five all stood idle in their position as they approached two massive doors. These doors had various Quincy designs of ancient and modern patterns. They could feel the oozing power from the Quincy seals which kept the door closed. It was as if they were staring into an eternal fire which gave that heating sensation. They all pondered at Ichigo, and waited for him to continue on. It is not as if they were allowed to get inside. They just assumed the higher-ranking Sternritter would tag them along as honorary guests. Come on out, Ichigo said in a low tone. They all questioned the situational and were surprised when Ichigo suddenly gripped the air before them and pulled down an invisible, racial wall which revealed an idle figure. The figure only smirked and walked out down the steps. He had a very 1940s-styled haircut along with a tight military uniform and black boots. Fucking Quilge, always being a freak. Sternritter J adjusted his spectacles. Insults from an STD. I am surprised you can move your lips with those bumps. The comeback stung, and Candace only cursed him back. She would have no problem fighting him, but Quilge is known as a rat in Vandenrake. He will report any wrongdoing for any rule broken at any time. Many people have seen unfortunate fates when dealing with him. Move! Ichigo yelled. I don't have any problems kicking your ass. I can go through here. You aren't even supposed to be near here. As much as Quilge hated to admit it, he was not at the highest clearance. His loyalty and strength had gotten him into a unique position as being the head of special units, but he was still not where he wanted to be. It had angered him greatly when Ichigo was promoted above him towards the Schutzstaffel. Yet the jail would never question His Majesty's words. You can be here, those creatures of stress management cannot. This is ancient ground you are on. Have respect for once in your life, Kurosaki, or perhaps I need to beat it into you again. Quilge never respected anyone in the army except for Yawach. Even the second in command had trouble dealing with him, as the stern Ritter never deemed him worthy enough to being by his side. Certainly he criticizing those above them was never a problem, since the only person he cared about was the Emperor. Ichigo brushed past Quilge and didn't even need to guide the four behind him. They weren't afraid of him, especially if he made the first move. But Ichigo could not forget Quilge. He had always been the same, especially since the first day he had met. It had actually been a while since he last saw him in Silburn. Apparently he was training his men for an invasion that would not occur in Soul Society, but rather another world. Either way, a rush of memories began flooding to Ichigo as he recalled Quilge. In fact, he was the one who had gotten him into the Vandenrake directly. He didn't come here with Meninas or Baz. They all fell into their own paths at one point and sadly had split. But all ended well, since they eventually had reunited together in this empire. Still, the memory was not a pleasant one. He always wondered if on that day things had gotten into a different path. If he had escaped from the grasp, or maybe even defeat his opponents. Such an idea now sounds ludicrous, as joining the Vandenrake he believes has been the best decision of his life. It had been 2 years since that special day with Baz and Meninas in the woods. The three had not left the town until they knew it was there to come. The job got better and better, but the threats got worse. More skilled figures had been traveling over as the town had acquired more wealth from the lack of being destroyed by attackers. This of course created power, and when someone has power they get recognized. Things, however, had gone very well into the regular life. They finally felt like they were a part of something and had been growing in strength ever since they came. Despite all of this, today was not the best day. Ichigo had become very fast for his age. From the slow teaching of learning Herenkyaku from Meninas, he was fairly skilled for being inexperienced. It was extremely useful for this particular situation. Running through the woods, trying to escape an ongoing pursuit. It all happened so fast he could barely remember. He remembers waking up and seeing Baz along with Meninas a few moments later. But then it had it. A massive explosion and a rush of arrows began raining down from the sky. He recalls his friends going off to see what was going on before an arrow had hit Baz himself. Naturally, he ripped it right out of his arm and proceeded to go in the direction it had fired. Ichigo was quick to react himself. Before he knew it, many strange men wearing white clothes, black goggles and gas masks rushed inside. They tackled in at high numbers and quickly began overriding the town guard. Ichigo created his bow and followed by taking aim. His bow had new changes. Not only was it white, but now the strings along with the arrows were no longer naturally blue, but pitch black, which now always streamed a flame-like atmosphere. He never knew why it was this way, as he was the only one he knew with such a characteristic. But many skilled fighters had told him it was just how naturally dark his Ryatsu was. It was no of concern right now, though. Ichigo could no longer maintain his position and was forced to leap into the air. Although he could not technically fly, he was able to stand in air unlike many Quincy. The skill had come naturally, which was confusing as only those who knew how to use Rapier proficiently in their feet could do. These fighters known as soldats stood no chance against Ichigo, as many of them tried to overwhelm him. However, the problems came when fire began engulfing the area around him. Feeling no other choice, he withdrew from the town and continued fighting outside. Things seemed to be going their way until a particular arrow nearly grazed his skull. The orange-haired Quincy turned around and was surprised to see multiple men who wore the exact same uniform, except they did not have anything covering their faces. Ichigo fell back and began struggling against the men who were proving to be much more capable than the regular soldat. It was until he realized that he was being slowly surrounded that he needed to retreat. It was now that he was running away from his foes. He did not necessarily see it as cowardly, as getting into a better position was the only way of doing things. In fact, the direction he was headed was more of a circle rather than a path far away. He couldn't just leave everything behind for obvious reasons, but these foes chasing him were skilled, so skilled they even dodged the traps which had been placed in case of situations like this. Ichigo had knowledge traveling in high-intense situations such as this one, but these men were professionally who seemed to know how everything in the dense forest worked. The moment the light of the end of the trailed, he readied his bow and dashed out of the forest. During a complete 180-degree turn, Ichigo turned the bow on its side and placed 3 fingers on the string. By pulling back using multiple fingers, 3 arrows formed and were launched behind him. These were no ordinary arrows. The 3 holy arrows were much longer than regular basic arrows. He could hear the sounds of agonizing pain as many bodies fell to the floor. Ichigo formed a defensive position and only waited what would come out. Nothing was to be scared from. These were just regular men fighting. As always, he expected things to win. You have to forgive my men. They clearly have had no experience hunting mere children down before. The low tone had startled Ichigo a bit. Before he knew it, a man walked out of the forest alone. He could see more of the same men hiding behind him. As if waiting for something to happen, Ichigo fired an arrow, but the man simply moved his head to the side and sighed. I guess there is always something valuable in the trash. He was practically a bald man with a black crop on the side. White uniform, white hat and very thick spectacle glasses. Who are you? Boy, you come straight out of a fantasy with that attitude. He walked closer. My name is Quiljopi. I have been ordered by His Majesty to extradite you to the Vandenrake. Appreciate it. The man gave a cunning grin in which Ichigo would never forget. He didn't exactly know what he was talking about, but it didn't matter. Taking a look at the man, he could tell he was somehow related to Hubert and Giselle from a long time ago. He hasn't seen people with this type of uniform since that day. Quilj awaited an answer, or rather, a response in acknowledgement, in confirmation. Another arrow shot past his head, and he lowered his eyes. I see your choice. Too bad it's not the one you were supposed to pick. Without a moment's hesitation, Ichigo watched as the man drew out a military-styled saber-like blade from his holster. In just one blink of the eye, the man appeared before him and slashed downwards. His bow was durable, tough enough to withstand a sword strike. Although struggling, Ichigo managed to kick the man in the chest just before his guard would break. The man did not seem to budge. He was taking this more as a joke rather than an actual fight. What? You scared? Ichigo taunted. The man smirked. You do not know the other side. I could explain to you everything, or I can just beat the reason into you. His Majesty-sama has asked not for your death, so I will keep you alive. But just know, our bodies are very durable. It was not so much worth explaining on how the two had fought. Naturally, the more trained and professional Quincy was able to overpower the younger one. It was not much of a challenge for the Sternritter, but his orders were specific. He did not give Ichigo the beating which he had wanted. His control over his own desires did not come above His Majesty's words. Quilj had made sure to knock the younger Quincy down and restrict his movements. The man had explained he was leader of the Jagdarmy, a special unit designed to capture and torture. Luckily for Ichigo, he was more of a target designed to be appreciated rather than treated as a prisoner of war. This day was a haunting one for a while. It was the first time in which defeat was soul-crushing. He had been worried of his friends. What would they do without him? Would they wonder what happens to him? He lay now on the floor, beaten and worn out. His face was turned to the side and had one eye open. You remember the plan? After we leave this shithole we're going to get close to him. We'll have to join his little army. They'll be suspicious if we come at once. So we gotta go at separate times. It doesn't matter really when, but one day we will have to. Ichigo knew that one day they would see them again. This time they will be in uniform rather than raggy-styled clothes. It would take a few more years, but it would happen. He stared up to Quilj and sighed in defeat. You win, and who is His Majesty? He asked with curiosity. Quilj spat. I know him as Juhabak, but you worms most likely refer to him as Yawach. Yawach, the name triggered in Ichigo's mind. It has been 4 years since he last saw him. And it has been 2 since the last time he has heard of him. Of course Baz would curse his name, but Ichigo never knew him well. He had only small bits of memories of when he had saved his life. And that had stuck with him. Memories of Yawach brought him memories of his mother. It wasn't every day he could remember much of that depressing moment. You will come see me when you are ready. Now he knows what he had meant. Ichigo now was only 12, a perfect age to be drafted into military service in Yawach's eyes. It did not sound so bad. He was always curious of the man, and thankful he had saved his life. If only his mother was around the time he had arrived. He could somewhat understand what all this was for. Get him a sense of the world before facing the path Yawach had told him about. It was his time to go. All right, I want to see Yawach. Quilj annoyingly grabbed him by the arm and lifted him to his feet. Soon many troops from Jagdarmy took him into custody. We will contact you in time? What kind of answer of that? Might as we have just given a simple no. Why must they lead her on and on as if they are actually considering it? She had made sure to give them a hard time and to not take her as a joke. She most certainly did not tolerate when people looked her down. Even if they were the Schutzstaffel, giving them a run for their money was something she enjoyed. An internal, frustrated scream was in order. Your physical prowess is dominate. But you have a temper. A temper? Does that still matter in this point in the game? She never considered her temper to be a handicap. In fact, she considered a bonus since usually her power can go eradicate and confuse the enemy. You have a weak mental state. That was when it had hit hard. No one has ever said such words to her before, so hearing it for the first time just filled her mind with confusion. What an insult! Just because they were considered to be stronger Quincy, doesn't mean they can just stomp on her pride like that. She busted through the hallway door and immediately felt the sense of multiple people. She didn't feel to be in the mood to be harassed by such people. She looked up into a large Colosseum hall and saw the familiar group. All but Giselle seemed to have distasteful gaze. Fuck is he smiling for? The two made eye contact, even from the long distance. The orange hair always made him easy to spot. His smile was optimistic, as if he truly believed she would be able to take the test without fail. Bambietta Basturbine and Kurosaki Ichigo had a history together, one stronger and closer than many might believe. She shrugged at them. As a joke, she launched some erasure at the group and laughed as they all, full of fear, leaped out into all directions. Her erasure, the moment it makes contact with anything, becomes a bomb and released immense power. This is how she usually enjoyed greeting her friends in times of anger. It certainly pissed them off but also made sure how to remind them who their leader is. You're all too slow. Looks like I have to remind you how to fight. Isshin Kurosaki was once a man with an impressive background. He was born into nobility. Descended from the once respected Shiba clan. Skill, talent, and abnormal Ryatsu were all the perks he was born with. It was no surprise that when he entered the Shinigami Academy he was very prosperous, and was able to gain such power in a little to no time. From not only being a healer expert in Kido, he attained much skill in wielding his Zanpakuto. His power at the time was unmatched by people his age, even being placed on high regard by the general commander himself. His prowess and skill all came together at an early age, and it wasn't long before he was leading his own division. Becoming the 10th captain was probably the most boring day in his entire life. Although, he was never one to do that much work, and becoming a captain of all things wouldn't be the most lax position. Yet, not everything had lasted as long as he thought they would. Looking back, being a captain wasn't so bad. His life had been dedicated towards his job and his division whether he liked it or not. Friends and bonds were created, and he created many great memories. It was his entire life. A part of him had died that day in which he gave up everything he had known in his life for one person. That person who was supposed to be a sworn enemy of his own race. The women had saved his own life, but Shinigami protocol forbids anyone giving their powers for another person, unless used to defend humans or the Soul Society. A Shinigami's life is to their own principles. No regret ever came to Isshin. It wouldn't be long until he married that certain girl. They had 3 kids, but the former Shinigami could never truly get over the loss he had sacrificed. His life prior to this was always fulfilling his duties as a Shinigami and his role as a captain. The lifestyle which he had led for around over 100 years ceased to exist in the matter of days. Everything was moving quickly, and he would only be grateful as to not have been executed by Central 46 rather than simply exiled. It has been a long time since this euphoric feeling came to his mind. He stood there with a sad smile on his face and looked down. It had been so long since he saw the red tachi along with a hexagon-designed blade. This was his sword, the same very sword which he used to fight for his life and save others with. Nothing could replace this sword. It had been a part of him since the day he first attained it. It was the only thing which he could have that connects to his long Shinigami past. Now, his responsibility was no longer to be a captain of the Godai 13 but something much simpler. Being a father was his ultimate goal now that the realization had finally hit. Floods of nostalgia and mixed emotions ran through his body as he could recall the last moment he had held such a weapon. This would be the reason why he can now live knowing full well nothing could harm his family. I never thought I'd see it again, he said with a nostalgic tone. Isshin was badly bruised, having wounds and deep cuts all over his body. Retaining powers was no easy task, but Urahara had strong faith in him. He was one of the strongest captains during his prime, his most feared Bankai, which many had only heard of its immense power. Surely every captain was glad he was on their side. Urahara lowered his eyes. So what will you do now, Isshin-san? Isshin only smirked. I will protect my children, of course. Whether from Hollows or Soul Society, it is the best thing I can do. I want you to help me, Kasuke, and you too, Ryukin. The two cringed at his speech and only came to attention the moment they felt powerful Ryatsu being raised from around. Ryukin stepped back. What are you doing? He asked in surprise. The atmosphere suddenly felt hot, and Isshin leaped out into the air. Burn! His friend stepped back in shock and watched as trails of burning flame came onto him at high speeds. Quickly using Harenkyaku and releasing his bow, the Quincy flashed and retaliated with a barrage of arrows. It was amusing to Ishin to finally stretch out his limbs and begin sparring once more. Adrenaline filled his body as he appeared before Urahara and struck his sword down. His fellow Shinigami comrade charged Ryatsu into his sword and released his power with a happy smile. The crescent moon was a favorite among many. It had a unique design which made its observers awe and fascination. It settled in this place for all of eternity, never completing its routine phase cycle. The crescent moon was frozen in place. It was as if time had somehow stopped for this world. It blended well with the grieving, pitch-black sky. The two have been looming over this barren, white desert since the beginning of the world's creation. This, along with the human world and soul realm, were the three life cycles of the universe. Hueco Mundo was the area in which many could be considered as the closest resemblance to hell itself. It contained nothing but consumption, greed, and emptiness. It was a place where those who died a tragic death were most likely to end up, or for the poor souls who perished with too many unfinished resolves in their lifetime to continue on. Many had past lives of struggle, and unfortunately for them, it never had seemed to improve during their time in the human world. Hueco Mundo was vast, arguably much vaster than either of the other two worlds combined. It was known as an infinite space of pure white sand, a black sky, a crescent moon, and a dangerous forest. What a forest! That didn't sound like something a desert would contain. Do not let the confusion fool you. It was most certainly an oasis in the eyes of Hueco Mundo's inhabitants. The oasis was the dream goal of consumption, and that is what it truly was. To the inhabitants, it was a forest of pure food and dreams of the future. However, many must be careful when traversing this oasis forest. The forest was comprised of many horrifying beings. These beings were known as hollows. These creatures were known to be aggressive, hungry, and would do anything to advance their own strength. Many of them resided there in hopes of gaining what they so desire. However, in most times, they were usually ended up being consumed by someone stronger. It was unheard of for humans other than Hollow to tread in these parts. It was maybe a nicely designed forest, as it had a silver-like quartz-like substance ooze all within it, but it was no real tourist attraction. Is everyone here? The tone was far too loud. Yes, we are here, said another voice which was sounded just a few inches away from the first one. This person was even louder. Urahara Kisuke had never gotten used to the yelling of his childhood friend. Shihoin Yoruchi sighed and pulled her hair into a ponytail. She followed the man until he chose to kneel down and pull a strange, handheld device suddenly. The female Shinigami never understood her friend's odd technological ingenuity, even if it had saved her life on many occasions. Not many could keep up with the former 12th Division captain. Only a few minds in the world could even come close. The man was a natural-born genius. Okay, with this device, the hollows here should not come to us as long as we don't cause trouble. His words were difficult to believe. So difficult, in fact, that some people simply flat-out ignored them. Gatugsa Tenshu. It was amazing what Urahara Kisuke could do with his mind. Here he had created a device which would allow the Shinigami to avoid being detected by the very numerous average hollows which resided in the forest of Minos. Such a thing was unheard of, but we are talking about the infamous Shinigami captain who was notorious for extracting Shinigami to the human world using forbidden Kido. It had not been him who used the technique, but it was his ingenuity and quick thinking which led many to believe he was responsible for this new crazed act in which hollows had infiltrated a Shinigami's soul and had taken over. It was rather his partner, Tessetsu Kabushi, who was known for this. However, despite all of this crazy information, not many took into consideration on his prowess and what he could do. The man sighed and observed his device as it started making loud noises. He closed his eyes and shut the device off, as now there was no point. It was frustrating, of course, but he, unfortunately, got used to people simply destroying his progress whether it was intentionally or not. Isshin Kurosaki had taken it upon himself to unleash one of his most notable techniques. The blue blast of power crashed into one of the areas of the Minos forest, which did nothing but attract more hollows. What? He asks as the other three gave him a blank stare. The man was excited to move and excited to fight once again. He wasn't the only one. Yoruchi suddenly decided to join the man as he went off on a cutting rampage. It was amazing how barbaric some could become at the first sight of potential aggression. Fury had risen in their hearts as the two laughed side by side while mercilessly slaughtering hollows. Will it be okay if I stay here? Ryukin pondered as he stood above Urahara. The blonde Shinigami smiled. Of course, Ishida-san. It would take an army of Quincy for Soul Society to notice, really. Plus, they do not keep much information on Hueco Mundo. The answer seemed to satisfy Ryukin. To him, killing hollows was always a displeasing option. Of course, there had been a war, and he had grown up in a household which forbade providing assistance to Shinigami. Only in emergencies was killing hollows an option, and even that had limits. The ancient war was fondly remembered by every Quincy. It had always left an impact, even if they were not personally affected by it. The impact was that Quincy's can no longer attack hollows in such a large numbers, as, eventually, it would disrupt the balance of souls. A brutal war was more than enough to enforce such a rule. Never before had it really ever been challenged. Not since 1,000 years ago, that is. Urahara Kisuke guided the group towards a more centralized area of the forest. Strangely, he had been coming here throughout his life and had learned his way around the forest through his travels. Or rather, he had developed devices to assist him during his adventures. The forest was not something which one person could remember. It was not a maze, or an infinite space within the world, but rather just a melting pot of death and confusion. They set a destination towards a large rock, that way they would be able to identify in case they got lost. The man then, out of nowhere, suddenly pulled a seemingly large briefcase from his jacket which baffled the lone Quincy. The case was opened and the three were amazed to see a keyboard along with a holographic screen which immediately turned on. The three couldn't really tell what was going on, but they trusted their friend to do his job. They had never underestimated Urahara. He, after all, had eluded Soul Society and proved his fearlessness through his experimentation. Even creating a Garganta for them all to travel was risky in itself. So what the hell is going on, Kisuke? Did we really need to come to this place to find one hollow? Yorichi asked with an irritated look in her eyes. Her friend smiled. Of course, Yorichi-san. After all, you just love meeting hollows, don't you? The injury was minor, but it did put him on edge from the electricity she was able to produce. His typing accelerated in the least. Perhaps that was just what he had needed. Tell us, she demanded. All right, calm down. We came here to look for him, right? Well, if it was the unfinished sentence was followed by a moment of silence. Urahara hung his head down a bit and continued on typing. It is fine, Kisuke. I can handle the reality. The candy shop owner nodded to his friend. Having to constantly remind Ishin that his son had most likely been eaten, or for whatever reason, taken by a hollow was not the best small talk. He was just trying to be considerate. Urahara never had kids, but could easily assume it was not something one would like to talk about often. But it was as Ishin had just said. It was the reality of the situation, and whatever hope there was, the four would try to seek it out. Not just for Ishin's sake, but also for Masaki as well. I had developed a device to detect if hollows had entered Karakura town. It is an invisible barrier which shields everything in a large radius. I don't usually check on it since hollows enter Karakura town in higher frequency than I had realized. I had created another device which was better suited for my original intentions. And those intentions are? Asked Ryukin. To detect Shinigami entering the vicinity. There was a moment of silence. That was right, and the two other Shinigami had forgotten about it. Ishin was exiled while Urahara and Yorichi were practically self-exiled. They never had a meeting to discuss his crimes of being affiliated with the Wizard or using forbidden Kido. Central 46 had knowledge and information of them, however, using it based on an account which was given by a particular 5th Division captain. The now ex-12th Division captain never had an urge to confront his crimes. Rather, he simply stayed in his own little candy shop and hid from the consequences. He never believed he did anything wrong, and confronting Central 46 would grant him a prison or a death sentence. Urahara never once believed he was safe, however, from persecution. That was why he had the Wizard so close to him, just in case an extradition to Soul Society was to take place. If he were forced to fight, then he would be forced to fight. Having this detection always alerted him in case Shinigami used the Senkamin to travel to the human world. But before it detected just Shinigami, it had detected hollows as well. Due to the massive influx of the creatures, he was forced to create one specifically just for Shinigami. After that, he had just kept the original running. All the hollows that come to Karakura town are either sent to Soul Society, or to Hell, but there hasn't been an incident since the past 2 months. Good thing you came to me as quickly as you could, Kurosaki-san. Ishin tilted his head. That doesn't make sense. Ichigo barely had any Riryoku, or if none at all. Why would it take him and leave Masaki there? That was the question which confused Urahara the most. Hollows may not be the most intelligent creatures, but they could all assume Masaki was worth far more than Ichigo. Humans in general are rich with Riryoku. But a fully grown adult was a full-course meal compared to little Ichigo. I've tracked the current Shinigami movements. She hasn't been around that part of town in a while. Most hollows hide in the suburban area, and none of them survive there forever. His trailing thoughts frustrated him. Okay, I'm going to try something new. Everyone, I want you to take these here and place them all in the surrounding area. This is where we will set up. He had given them all small, metal-like, gray rods which could be easily hidden in the surrounding area. They could assume this had something familiar to do with barriers surrounding Karakura town. They all knew this operation was going to be massive, but all of them were happy to be back in action. Ryukin and Isshin had been living normal human lives, but it was now a wake-up call to work on their own self-progress. It was worth it. It gave everyone hope and something to finally feel the need to do. It brought joy to Urahara, who was a genius, to finally do something for someone else, to use his gift once more to help out a friend and to stick with it until the end. Let's see here if all Hollow eventually gets sent back. Then I will have to go back to when the Hollow first arrived. The man delved deeper into his backlogs to see when every Hollow spotted had entered Karakura town. 10 years, he says before gathering up on a massive amount of files. No, all Hollows from 10 years ago had an equal departure as well. 20 years? Going back even further was a challenge. Luckily, he had taken this technology from the Shinigami Research and Development Institute, which was worlds ahead of human technology. 20 years did not seem to cut it either, so Urahara decided to jump the gun and double it. What kind of Hollow is this? Eluding Shinigami for more than 40 years, he jumped the gun once more. Just as he typed away, his 3 comrades had returned. You placed all of them? Good job, he quickly uttered before focusing his attention back on the computer. The devices connected to the trees and earth of the Minos forest. This gave a radar field, which could detect Hollows from miles away. These were the same tools in which he used to create the barrier which could detect Shinigami. Got it! He yelled in excitement. Every time something comes into Karakura town from another world, it is tagged by an ID. The devices are able to do this by giving it a simple number. The first Hollow received 1, and the following you can make out. This particular Hollow, which recently vanished from the city, came here over 50 years ago. 50 years. 50 years this Hollow had been eluding the Shinigami. Urahara knew Soul Society must have some knowledge on the creature. For it to be hidden for so long, it must have gained quite an ego from being able to outsmarting the Soul Reapers. But why did it all of a sudden decide to go back to Hueco Mundo? There wasn't any rich Riryoku there he could grab. If anything, it was dangerous for the Hollow, as an even bigger Hollow may try to eat it. Something must have happened during the encounter with Masaki. That ID which I got from the Hollow never left for over 50 years. Something bad must have happened to it when it confronted Masaki-chan. Yorichi stepped in. Maybe it got hurt? Masaki knew how to fight. Neither Isshin nor Ryukin bought it. Masaki was more than enough for a Hollow, especially on this scale. If it were something out of the ordinary, like a Vastal Lord, Soul Society would have been alerted, and a squad would have been dispatched out. Whatever this Hollow is, it wasn't as strong as we believe. Ryukin was just as good as Urahara when it came to analysis. He had known Masaki the best, and knew very well she could handle more than just a meager Hollow. That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that I have 1 bit of that Hollow's Ryatsu on this computer right now. My barrier allows me to take in the smallest bit of Ryatsu, Shinigami or Hollow, and transfer it to the database. Although this was supposed to just grab information on the Shinigami patrolling Karakura town, it fortunately grabbed everything. I can now extract this Ryatsu ID from the database, and hold it in a special position. Words, words, and more words. The 3 were equally confused. He tried explaining it again, the simplified version. Back when Urahara first moved into Karakura town, and created his self-isolationist candy shop, he was worried Shinigami would try to track him down. He was not paranoid to believe such a thing. Since he was a captain, he was used to prioritize on a high alert threat level. So, to better prepare himself, he devised many inventions which could give him some time to gain knowledge on his future attackers. The barriers were his first invention. He initially stole them from the 12th Division headquarters and then modified it to fit his own needs. The new Kido-style barrier was able to detect in motion the presence of not just the Senkyaman, but, unintentionally, sense a Garganta as well. This, of course, created a massive influx of reports since Hollows came at a high rate. Eventually, he could no longer handle such reports and decided to abandon the first barrier and create a new one. By simply copying the older one, Urahara eventually over many years learned how to filter out a Garganta and the Hollows that came through it. This way, he could finally focus on Shinigami presence in his city. And it worked. Every new Shinigami which came to watch over Karakura town was closely monitored by the former captain. Genius, on a whole new level. So what now, damn it? Yelled Ishin. The man was bored out of his mind. Now we have to go deeper. I can make hundreds of these rods. They are like radar sensors. The more we place, the more chances we have to detect the same Ryatsu from the hollow that vanished. Then we will know. Ishin was the first to stare into the abyss. His Zanpakuto was placed over his shoulder and was ready to start fighting. Ryukin lined up next to him and pulled out his white quincy bow. His own skills would be of great assistance as he can quickly clear out hordes of hollow. Yoruchi appeared and placed her hand on Ishin's shoulder. She was the fastest and could run farther into the forest. The two smirked at the path ahead of them. Pure danger always thrilled them. But as the realization hit them once more, Ishin lost his smile and lowered his eyes. Determination filled his mind, and hope filled his blade. He's out there, Ishin, we just got to find him. The three spent years in this forest. Some would came on their own time, while on the weekend they would all went together. Searching for this hollow was never easy as it had its own ways of manipulation. Eventually, after many years, they could no longer pursue this destination. But it was important to know as Ishin had never really given up looking for his own. A turn of events had forced all of them to focus on other more recent issues which required all of three of their attention. He never wanted to give up. He never wanted to stop, but Ishin had two other kids. Two others kid that he needed to make sure would live a healthy life. He felt sorry for everything, as if he had somehow left Masaki and Ichigo behind. The truth was, he could never really accept the fact that they were truly gone. It was more in a sense that their spirits would always be with him. Dead or alive, he only wished for the best possible outcome. Never in either of their wildest dreams did they imagine what had actually happened. It was only a matter of time until fate made them cross paths again. Ichigo now could lay on the couch in his quarters in pure silence. The commotion in the auditorium was starting to get to him. It was getting far too loud for him to be in that room without getting a headache. He was trying to get some more sleep before the next annoyance came to bother him. He had been careful enough to cover his tracks. The last thing he would wanted was for someone to bother him when he was resting. Someone was already there. Two hands covered his drowsy eyes. Guess who? He placed one hand onto her own and gave one tight squeeze. Giselle, he said. What is it? She removed her hands and stared deeply into his eyes, which barely could crack open. He could see the smiling face of Sternritter Z. Giselle Gawel. She was hovering over the back end of the couch. Found you, Ichi-chan, she yelled. Giselle Gawel and Ichigo had a long history together. She was the first Sternritter he had ever met, and was given a fair impression. Ichigo also knew she had saved his life through various means. Although, he believed she was unaware of her doing and instead was simply acting on her own accord. Either way, he could only be grateful from there on out. How did you get in here? He asked with a suspicious gaze. She clutched her chest. So mean. Ichigo widened his eyes in pain as the girl lumped up her body and straddled him. But if you like it bad, Giselle knew exactly how to play Ichigo by the book. Ever since he arrived at the Vandenrake, the two have spent a lot of time together. She sat up and began rubbing his chest back and forth. It was comforting to say the least. It wasn't if he was going to complain about it. So Ichi-chan. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the message. Yes? She smirked. So I heard you're going somewhere. The moment she began to speak directly, she shifted her movements. The zombie would flex her fingers and moved her hands elsewhere, and it was rare for him to relax. The days have been getting more and more hectic due to the increased amount of activity and preparations for the upcoming war. Giselle was the only person who he could trust to help him relax. The others were either too strong or too shocking or too angry to create such an atmosphere. She stopped. Ichigo opened his eyes with disappointment. What? Yeah, we're going to Hueco Mundo. He immediately regretted the statement. It was supposed to be a secret among the Sternritter. She immediately resumed the massage which soothed his newfound stress. He had strict orders not to reveal the assignment until further notice. And just like that, he had cracked under the lightest pressure. Really? I can come right? She ran her fingers through his hair and rubbed his neck. Giselle lifted herself so she could look at him, face to face. Right. Lips connected and the two enjoyed for a moment each other's bliss. Giselle now lay on top while Ichigo wrapped his arms around her. It would not wrong to assume he always had a connection with her. Imagine Ichigo growing up and going through puberty while being very close with some already full-grown females. The tension would often become heated between these two, but Giselle was a sadist, and she always left him very heated. Right, he managed to utter during the moment. Giselle sprung up and lifted her arms in the air. Yay! She got off and pointed her finger upwards. Told you, Lily-chan. It was difficult for Ichigo to blush. It wasn't like back when he was younger, when practically everything got him nervous. Nowadays, it still happened. However, it was only when situations like this would occur. Ichigo looked to his side and flared in embarrassment when he saw 3 other females sitting on his bed. They were watching the whole time. How the hell did you all get in here? He looked toward his large doors. The Schutzstaffel all had much more secluded quarters than the rest of the Sternritter. They practically had miniature palaces. It was strange for anyone to somehow break in, Liltato sighed. Damn, you were right. I'm disappointed in you, Ichigo. The glutton always seemed to hold him in such a high regard. Perhaps it was because the two enjoyed using their brains rather than their power a lot more. They had spent time together since they actually used reason and logic before striking alone. It was the only thing which kept them apart from the rest. Liltato was only disappointed in Ichigo to see him fall to such levels. Your desire for lust has blinded you, Kurosaki. Shut up, he replied. Candace smirked. Haha, there he goes. That red face. Every time. The Thunderbolt burst out into laughing as his face got even more crimson. I miss this. The female Quincy always enjoyed teasing him into such a position. Her natural sadistic ways brought her intense joy to see him suddenly lose his ground and become paralyzed from basic embarrassment and nerve-wracking emotions. Candace, shut up. Meninas looked at her fried with a blank expression. I think it's pretty cute. It was a lot better when he was younger. The 3 giggled while Sternritterji sighed. They explained their wishes to see him in such a state but were too late. He was practically fully grown now. Being 17, there wasn't much development needed to be done. His physical build had become quite impressive. Although, the majority of the Quincy were in fairly good health. Many! He yelled. His female friend had always taken sides in these situations. Giselle leaped in front of him. So Ichi-chan. We're going, right? You and I. She gave a heartwarming expression and had held him tightly. Ichigo was able to calm himself down and placed his hand on her head. Fine, I know you'll need zombies for Soul Society anyways. But don't tell anyone about this, got it? The zombie nodded her head and pulled back from him. Don't be jealous, Ichi-chan loves me and hates you sluts. The uproar from this comment by Giselle created a string of heated arguments between her and mainly Candace, although often Meninas would jump in if someone had called her out. Liltato sat by and simply ate food as she studied with fascination how her friends of the same gender could get so upset over such comments. Maybe it was because the statement was true, or maybe the context and background had triggered such a heated reaction. Either way, she felt sad to be even affiliated with those people. Wait! Ichigo yelled, where's Bambietta? He asked. The Sternritter looked around the room and failed to find the 5th female of the group. Did you guys leave her? The 4 shrugged at the last question. They didn't seem to mind leaving their leader behind. I don't know. Who cares? Bitch tried to kill us. She's pretty mad at me. Not sure if she loves me right now. The 4 responses disappointed the male Quincy. You guys are awful. Was his statement before vanishing into the wall. It always confused him on how these 4 could be so different when their leader was not around. It was as if they only sought out her protection during battle, but when it was over, they'd show nothing but criticism and irritation to the explode. It was indeed worrisome. Ichigo had befriended all of them, so to see them pick sides was not something he enjoyed watching. Especially since they always left the leader alone, something she hated to the core. Silburn was a massive fortress from within. On the outside, it could look like a small little palace. The interior had much to offer for those who resided in it. Apart from the large quarters, there were many lounges and areas which the residents could use. Ichigo found himself walking across through these areas and often stumbled on Sternritter who casually hung around. One of these areas so happened to be a lounge filled with them. A look at that, a Schutzstaffel member gracing us with his presence. What have we done to deserve this? The attention suddenly all focused on Ichigo, who walked into this lounge while he stared at the man who made the snarky comment. Come on, you know I'm not like that, Ichigo replied before sitting down alongside everyone. The man had slicked back hair and a lazy aura which made him seem at casual odds most of the time. What about you, Askin? I know you've been out of Silburn recently. The comment made the man sweat a little. The death dealing was always a wild card out of Yawacha's pocket, and only had used him in special situations. PSSH, you know damn well, Askin. Hey Ichigo-sama. Ichigo-sama. Take care of my small body, Ikkyo-sama. Everyone laughed as Nana Najikup impersonated Giselle and her clinging ways. Rumors had always floated around the Vandenrake between the two. The underbelly had always been a creepy one. That tone bothered him a bit, but he showed some restraint. Now, everyone relax. Ichigo here finally got some information about some interesting stuff. Tell us, Kurosaki. We going to war or what? Driscoll Bursey was an eager one. He would at least give Ichigo the time to explain himself before cracking jokes and making the situation worse. Ichigo smirked. Nah, we're settling a peace deal. They keep everything while we give up our weirdest, he replied before darting his attention across the room. Berenice, time to go. The female sternritter spat in his direction. Fuck off, Ichigo, everyone knows I got more balls than Baz here. Bazby was not amused while the whole room, including Ichigo, ruptured into laughter. It took a while before the room head was able to calm down. Berenice wasn't like the other females who prepped their hair and had many stereotypical female attributes. She enjoyed hanging out with guys most of the time. Not to mention she was also kicked out of the female clique. Baz cursed the girl. Cut the shit, Ichigo. We know you got something for us. So who the hell is going to Hueco Mundo? The room went silent as once again the attention was focused on Ichigo. He sighed. Nope. Not sure what you're talking about. Lying was one of Ichigo's great skills. Very few Quincy could actually detect when he was. For a moment, they all seemed to buy his words. He was never one to not be trusted. Some Quincy had a reputation of being hard to work with or were known to betray their comrades when it fitted them best. There was a good reason why he decided to lie to everyone. If people found out that resources were about to be spent on Hollow Land occupation, they would get pissed. Not to mention the true reason for invading would reduce the Vandenrake pride to a new low. Having Arrancar fight their wars would be an insult, Berenice replied. Hold up there. Baz, no one can take you seriously with that fucked up toupee of yours. The question was lucky that they were in a room filled with people rather than alone with the heat. No one insults his mohawk without consequences. Kurosaki, tell me, are we going to Hueco Mundo? Very few Quincy could actually detect when he was lying unless one had a power which would force him to tell the truth. Stupid power. And are you sleeping with Hashwalth? Nope. The amused snort gave him barely enough time to escape the room without most of them noticing. However, two pairs of disinterested eyes had caught him just in time to see him quickly vanish. Bazby along with another sternritter rose from their seats, and quickly pursued Ichigo, who was now leaving the area. If something was going on, those two always had to be a part of it. The roof of Silburn was arguably the most heavenly placed in the entire Vandenrake city. It overlooked the large realm and all of its glory. From the top, one could see the distant blizzard shields and the thriving militarily complex which surrounded the fortress. The refreshing breeze was not as intensely cold as it was in the center of the fortress. It could even be said that this was actually the only nice part to be in, as everything else was just overlooking up at the abandoned buildings or only dream about being part of Silburn. Ichigo never truly appreciated the Vandenrake city until he had first come up here. It was private, as few sternritter had known about it. Privacy was always something which many sought out within the fortress. Even if they all had their private quarters, the area seemed to be too confined to keep them within. Everyone wanted more and more space, to be out in the open and travel further. Ichigo came there by accident. He was actually looking for his room when it had happened. It was a little odd to find a room at the top of a long staircase, but he was surprised to find out it was simply another exit. Oftentimes he would to go up there alone. Only one person would ever bother to come all the way up there. It was someone who enjoyed the view just as much as he did. It was only meant for the people who truly cared about the Empire and its future. He saw her cape and smiled to know she had come to the one place where he expected her to be. She was simply staring off into the distance, and was lost in her own thoughts. It was rare for her to get some alone time, as usually she would often be with her female squad. Ichigo coughed. Sternritter, he spoke with an amusing formality. She looked over. I would like to congratulate you on your test. Your service to the Vandenrake is unmatched. You are always on the mind of the officers. Bambietta rolled her eyes. He never really spoke in this imitated formal fashion before. She thought it was a bit amusing and cracked a small smile. He could barely see it but was filled with a sufficient amount of confidence to continue on. He killed his formal act and went with the more casual approach which she knew him for. Yo, seriously, I need you for something. She looked a tad more attentive, then sighed. She sighed before he continued, I can't just tell them I didn't win. They look up to me, you know. It wasn't really something he expected her to say. Ichigo always knew this was part of who she was. She cared for her image and was always proud to be the leader and one of the more powerful Quincy. Pernita and Gerard, they are both fucking abnormal, you know what I mean, right? Her confused expression was no surprise to Ichigo. She had a passion for explaining her own problems to others who were willing to listen. Ichigo enjoyed talking to her, and had always been willing to give advice when needed. Gerard Voix and Pernita Parnquiaz were both respectable, unique Quincy. Out of all the Quincy in the Vandenrake, only 3 of them possessed powers which was not given by Yhwach. Thus, rumors had spread around that the 2 were directly connected to the Soul King in some odd way. These rumors turned out to be actual facts. Gerard was the heart of the Soul King, while Pernita was the left hand. It would be very strange if that was the case. It's hard to comprehend the fact that a fellow Sternritter was in actuality a living fucking hand. It was easier to believe Gerard's case. Saying he was the heart of the Soul King gave a more symbolic reference, but those who knew his true power had no doubt believing such a thing, and the 3rd Quincy was right here. What are they? She asked. Ichigo sighed and walked to stand next to her. By now they could watch with some amusement as Candace threw lightning bolts at Giselle from down below. It looked like it was as if Giselle had thrown some snowballs at her comrade's head. They could see the dripping white substance dripping from her hair. Bambietta Basterbine had a reason which influenced her decision to join the Schutzstaffel. It was not because Ichigo was there, and that she simply wished to be by his side. It went without saying, but she did care for the Vandenrake. It was her life, ever since she came here with Yhwach such a long time ago. The Empire was her pride and joy. It was the one thing she cared for more than her own appearance. Getting promoted high in the military boosted her self-confidence, and she never wanted to stop being useful for Yhwach. She would always strove to be at the top, but it had been a long time since she received her Sternritter promotion. Even if it was one of the most proud moments of her life, she was sad to think that was it. The reason for this being discussed now is because she discussed it now because she felt that the Schutzstaffel test was not really a satisfying thing to take. The Explode wanted more in her life. To rise even higher and contribute more than she already had. Ichigo sighed. They are pretty weird. Lille is alright, but they aren't as special as most people believe. She didn't buy it. From what she saw, their powers were completely foreign. Only Gremmy had powers which could compare to what she had fought against. It certainly left an impression in her mind. Forget about it, I'm just glad we're going to war already. All this time preparing, I'll show them then. He courageously wrapped his arm around in her a friendly manner. I got some official information for you about in the invasion. She widened her eyes in surprise. Normally, Ichigo was not one to bring up such topics. He had sworn to fulfill his obligations by protecting Yhwach, and this valuable information was important to keep out from getting into the wrong's hands. We're going to declare war soon, and you've been selected to attend during the declaration. His smile gave it all away. She was taken aback, as if surprised to be chosen for such an early phase in the war. Her skill wasn't best for stealth and quietness, but who the hell cares? His Majesty chose me? She asked with an optimistic tone. Ichigo nodded. For the first invasion. You were prioritized for first engagement as well. He always knew when the Explode was feeling a bit down. It was obvious she was disappointed in herself for losing to the other Schutzstaffel members during her test. She was not one to become gloomy often, and he always tried to do his best to try to turn it around. Bambietta became a very close friend for him, even if at first things didn't start that way. Over the course of many years, Ichigo learned to care for her in the same way he cared for Meninus or Giselle. Her composure didn't last long. She lowered her shoulders and pretended to be relaxed. I see. Well, if I am not busy, I will think about it. This was her way of expressing excitement. She couldn't just demonstrate an uncharacteristic attitude which seemed uncharacteristic. The two stared off into the distance, and saw yet again Lil Tato dodge attempted strikes from Candace, who was now starting to lose it. Apparently, Giselle had tricked Sternritter T into falling down into more slush of ice and dirt. Bambietta couldn't help but laugh at her friend's mistake. Although Candace was the most common female she could relate to the most, their massive egos which tended to collide in brutal ways. She looked at him with an intense glare. You're coming with us, right? I mean the invasion. She quickly had corrected herself. Obviously, the Schutzstaffel were to be nothing but bodyguards. Why else would they go off on their own like the rest of the Sternritter? Their entire rank was designed to protect Yhwach. However, there were exceptions. And Ichigo used these exceptions regularly. The moment he smiled was then the moment she realized. Hell yeah, I'm going. His Majesty will be fighting the Captain Commander. I will be in the area to ensure his fight is one-on-one. The two got some history or whatever. Either way, when the fight is over, I'll just slip out. Ichigo took his rank and job seriously, but knew that the Emperor was no weak man. He always has Hashwalth nearby, and that was really all he needed. If things got serious, Ichigo would be the last one to come in. And that is if the opponent would be able to cut down the rest of the Imperial Guard. I see. Then you have no other choice. I guess I can let you come into our group. That is, if you don't wish to be a loner. She spoke as if the decision had already been made, and truthfully it really had. Although Ichigo hung out them quite often, more so than anyone else, he was never officially a part of their clique. It consisted of a hierarchy, which meant that Bambietta was the leader and everyone else did what she commanded. She had grown to tolerate and enjoy his presence, as he was far less annoying than anyone else in the group. Or you can be with Baz, and be part of the sausage fest. He couldn't help but laugh at his red-haired friend. He's going to be pissed to find out that Ichigo would rather hang out with the weird girls than his own posy. As leader, you must tell me if anything important happens. Doing so, you will grant you benefits. Ichigo found it very amusing to hear such words. Being promised certain benefits by joining compared to having what he had now. It's all fun, but he decided to play along since this did mean a lot to Bambietta. Being the leader of her own group gave her confidence. And with Ichigo joining, they may rise higher in power. He laughed warmly. Any rules? She changed the atmosphere and looked at him with a serious expression. Just one. Don't ever leave me behind. Got it? His laughter died down. It was such a strange rule coming from such a powerful woman. He was expecting something along the lines of, don't get in my way or, don't question my orders. But this was something different. He didn't dwell on it for too long. After all, you did leave me in your quarters this morning. I still haven't forgotten about that. Care to explain why I was there in the first place? The atmosphere was heating up. Ichigo needed a quick way to change the topic. We were training and you passed out was his answer. She lowered his eyes and waved her hand. Fine, I'll forget about that one, Ichigo. But no more of that, all right? Got it. And for God's sake call me Bambi. It hurts to hear you butcher my name every time. He shrugged. His arms, fine. But I got to ask you something. I'm going to need you for Hueco Mundo. She tilted her head. Hueco Mundo, the hell are we going there for? He leaned against the railing. His Majesty wishes to draft Arrancar into our army. This was such an odd statement. For a moment, she refused to believe his words. There was a reason why this was kept a secret for so long. Yawach did not want to hear and gain a headache from the annoying Sternator who would complain about it. The Explode could put 2 + 2 together, and assumed that was the reason. It was annoying and stressful to her. Everyone knew full well that only the Emperor of the Quincy would go as far as to draft Arrancar of all creatures into the Vandenrake. Someone is coming, he alerted her. I guess I'll see you later. She smirked and turned back around. In just a flash, the girl had disappeared before him. Ichigo knew she had things to do now that she knew she would be soon heading out for Soul Society firsthand. She still hadn't released her excitement, and was eager to get some time alone to do so. Ichigo was proud to have even taught her such a technique. Although she was a novice, Bambietta had no prior knowledge of her Renkyaku. It was just something he felt she needed in order to fight the trio of the Schutzstaffel. He sat alone in silence and sighed, as he felt an oncoming presence. He looked to the door, and watched as an older-looking man with similar outfit as Ichigo's approached him with a calm expression. He had ordinary glasses and hair, short, gray-styled hair. Robert de Coutron looked at Ichigo and nodded. His Majesty is looking for you. If that was the case, Ichigo had no other choice but to comply. He nodded back and the two began heading down toward the lower areas of Silburn. It was a bit nostalgic, coming down here. Normally, he could simply use his own power to enter the throne room. But this time he wanted to enjoy the walk. He could remember the first time he walked through the large, empty hallway. All those memories of running down here in full speed and excitement. Yawach had been to him the parent and the guidance he needed in his life as he grew up here. Yawach, what did the man mean to him really? Sure, he had saved his life. Ichigo never once forgot about that. He was happy to know he was able to fulfill what his mother originally wanted. Yawach had supposedly slain the beast that killed his mother, but he could not be eternally grateful. Memories soon flooded into his mind as he could fully recall about the event in which he had first met Yawach. These memories were precious to him. They helped build the foundation of the person he is today. Nothing could compete with that moment. It was the moment he swore his allegiance and had joined the Vandenrake. Ever since that day, he had been a loyal solider dedicated to the final goal of true peace, the war. It would not be wrong to assume he was a bit nervous because of the upcoming invasion. A full all-out scale war meant he and those he cared for were in danger. Ichigo was confident since he was one of the strongest Quincy in the Empire. However, he knew he could not just take on the might of the entire Godai 13 by himself. He hoped his friends could handle themselves if they stuck together. Especially some of the weaker ones who weren't as unique, or had special powers like he did. Either way, Ichigo never showed true fear when battling. That was something Yhwach had personally taught him. Yhwach, it came to him once more. The memories of their first meeting. It was embarrassing to reminiscence now, but back then it was the best comfort he could have had. Flashback. The atmosphere had suddenly grew cold and thick. Ichigo was held by the, "Is that what you meant?" The sentence was too confusing. Two men who walked behind their leader. Quilji Opie was happy to know that the smaller Quincy had no more issues in accepting the extraction to the Vandenrake. The orders to him were simple. Take Ichigo with whatever means necessary and to bring him back unharmed. Now, it wasn't the Sternritter's fault Ichigo tried fighting. Quilj could only hope His Majesty would understand that before becoming upset. In fact, it was starting to bother him now. Orders were explicit, and the jail always had striven for perfection. He would often look back to see if Ichigo had any noticeable marks or bruising. Luckily for him, the younger Quincy was tough and handled the defeat fairly well. Ichigo did not speak much on their little walk. He seemed to actually be somewhat excited in his own way. Even if his face did not it, Ichigo was eager to meet the man who had saved his life all those years ago. He had heard so many different opinions about him, the man. Most of people hated him for obvious reasons. Burning, killing, and destroying everything they had created never left a good impression. However, very rarely and surprisingly would he encounter a fanatic who only said good things about Yhwach. They would describe him as God, or the coming savior destined to bring the Quincy name back to glory. "Stand back, I need to open the Shatten breach," the jail ordered. His two men from the Jaguarimi nodded and pulled Ichigo back a bit. Even they knew not to be rough with him. The orders were made very clear. Before Ichigo knew it, a large black shadow was cast onto a large rock. "Watch your step. I am not entirely used to doing this on my own," he said before cautiously placing his foot on the ground. Ichigo watched with a surprised expression as the Sternritter's leg completely vanished into the black portal. It took a while for him to gain his footing, as if wherever he is going was not entirely solid. The first Solider followed Quilj and instructed Ichigo to grab his hand. He followed and was soon entirely taken by the shadow. His body went through and he struggled to gain footing. After his head reached inside, Ichigo could only wonder at the blackness they had just entered. Pure blackness was ahead of them, behind them, and surrounding them. "What is this?" Ichigo asked in shock. He could make out his guides, as they were practically bound together. "This is the Shatten breach, Shadow Realm," said Quilj as he cautiously skid his right foot across the flooring. The man flinched back as the path ahead of him suddenly became frail and empty. "Not this way," he instructed before moving around Ichigo while searching for another way forward. Ichigo was now in the same basket as the three Quincy around him. No one exactly knew what was going on, and only hoped for the jail to safely guard them. But something had caught the orange-haired boy's eye. Far off in the opposite corner Ichigo could barely make out a bright light which glowed with yellow, sun-like energy. "Is that it?" he asked with hope. Quilj darted his eyes around and formed a small smirk. "That boy, that is not for us as of right now. One day, everyone will go there. One day you will go there." Ichigo, would only curiously thought about, tried to understand what he had meant by that. The light was so transparent and different from the area around it. It stood out like a star in the night sky. If fear hadn't been on his mind, Ichigo would have loved to see what lay beyond that bright light. The four carefully walked through the Shadow Realm at a very slow pace. Nobody complained, as Quilj had warned that falling into the abyss is certain death. It was not for the lack of a bottom, rather, one would simply die of lack of nutrition as no one could possibly escape. It drilled fear into many. A long, cold, dark, and painful death. "Watch out," Ichigo warned. He leaped forward and grabbed Quilj by the arm. The Sternitor looked down in shock and watched as the platform below him was disintegration before his eyes. The jail moved backward and could barely sense the smaller path which could barely keep his own two large boots from hovering over. "You can see it?" he asked with hint of surprise and interest. Ichigo was taken back. "See? I guess. You cannot? I can only sense it at the last minute. You are truly the chosen one. Not all of us can use shadows. Perhaps you should lead way." "A chosen one? Shadows? It is not a big deal. You have killed 3 of my men, I expect you to do this task. Simply use your power and control of Reisher to create a pathway for us. After moments of awkward stepping, Ichigo was now leading the group. The sensation of this abyss-like world left a calm feeling in his mind. This world was totally quiet, not a gust of wind, and even the steps did not make a sound. It was not difficult walking through this world once he had started leading. Using his rapier, the three could see a bright blue path form before their eyes. Normally, Quincy cannot use the rapier in the Shatten Breach because there simply was no rapier to absorb, as the majority of Quincy had believed. Ichigo, somehow, was able to take the energy from the Shadow Realm and use it to create a useful tool for the four. His Ryatsu was normally blue, as with most Quincy, so the combination created a bright light. The other three did not bother talk, as breaking his concentration would mean certain death. Quilge was impressed as not many Vandenrake members can use shadows. All he could do was create the portal and carefully make it through the abyssal hellhole. Ichigo seemed to not be challenged by the task. It was no different from creating a bow or an arrow. Yet, despite the intense focus and the surprisingly well composure, a feeling kept creeping up his spine. His eyes were focused on the rapier platform, but something had caught his attention. Deep down in the abyss there were two circular lights which stood around side by side. This was a lot different from the light which was far above them. He was curious, but did not want to descend deep into this world. "What's wrong?" asked Quilge as Ichigo had suddenly froze. The younger Quincy remained frozen and stared down with shocked eyes as he could witness the two beams of light suddenly move on their own. They came closer and closer to the four. He knew he could not act and move out of the light's way, since if he did he would lose full concentration and the path would shatter. Nothing. Ichigo trailed off as he began focused once more. The four began walking much faster, as Ichigo was now going at an abnormal speed. The orange-haired Quincy did not bother looking at the strange circular lights that he sensed still followed him. Eventually, after much travel, Quilge placed his hand on Ichigo's shoulder. "Stop, it's here," he instructed. The jail placed his hands on a thin disc with the insignia design of the Vandenrake. Following after, a light blue stream rose from the medallion and gripped the abyssal wall. A bright light soon revealed itself and the four did not hesitate to leap inside of its oaring gaze. They entered the light, and were immediately hit by a gush of cold air that was almost painful. The Sternritter cursed since he knew he did not enter at the right coordinates from the Shadow Realm, and therefore entered into a different area in this new world. The four could not see what was in front of them as a thick blizzard forced them bound to go in only one direction. Luckily, Sternritter J could sense his fellow Quincy from a distance. He knew at least they were headed in a direction which eventually would guarantee their arrival at the hesitation. At this point, the four wished they had gas masks, to protect their faces from freezing sensation that hit their faces. "Step back," Quilge ordered. The three did as told and watched in surprise as the man released a torrent of powerful Ryatsu. The energy was strong, so strong it blew the blizzard around them and revealed an open path to a distant town. Now that Ichigo witnessed one of the most magnificent cities he had ever laid eyes on, he appeared with the other three Quincy who were relieved to be back into their home world. The air was cold and snow came down from the sky like rain. It was a long time since Ichigo last saw the pure white feeling of snow so near to him. He looked behind him and only could wonder what else was out there. The blizzard surrounded the massive city as if somewhat like a defensive shield. His body shivered from the weather. He didn't necessarily dislike the cold, but he felt it was a bit too freezing for a normal, comfortable day. He eagerly followed Quilge into the city. The man was hopeful to finish his mission and get the kid away from him. Ichigo awed at the interior of the city and watched with curiously as hundreds, if not thousands of men dressed in military uniforms and gas masks huddled around the lower buildings. He could also see a food court where many soldats rested to gain their energy back for more training. He looked up to see giant medieval-style towers that looked abandoned but gave the center of the massive city an architectural grace. Quilge dismissed his two men and instructed Ichigo to walk beside him. He didn't speak, but rather kept his attention focused on the surrounding troops. He was a military instructor himself, as the entire Jagdarmy was under his command. It annoyed him to a high extent when he saw other military drills done in a way which he did not like. However, he did not have any command over the regular soldat, and was forced to be quiet since they were not under his control. Not many soldat dared to stare down at the Sternritter or his acquaintance. He was the worst nightmare for them. Ichigo stopped and stared up at the destination. He was now at the very center of the city, and only could be confused by the strange design. It was a wide, two-tiered building. The bottom tier was supported by 6 thick columns, while the upper tier was roughly half in size and was held up by pillars. It also featured windows made of 2 thin slats in the wall on either side. A set of stairs led to the lower tier, and the entire complex was surrounded by an angular barrier with octagonal joints. To put simply, it was a fortress. He entered the fortress and was confused to see how massive it was from the inside. There were 2 large hallways, both left and right. However, Quilge had led Ichigo down the smaller, narrower straight pathway directly in front of them. The 2 walked down a staircase, went through more empty halls which was finally starting to leave Ichigo that bored Ichigo. Luckily for him, the 2 approached a descending staircase that finally led them to 8 large statues that guarded 2 massive white doors. The doors themselves had one massive Vandenrake symbol along surrounded by many ancient Quincy designs that brightened the dark room. I'll take it from here. You are dismissed, Sternritter J. Ichigo and Quilge looked to the side. They both narrowed their eyes at the sight of a tall man with long blonde hair and green eyes. The appearance was immediately captured by Ichigo. Jagram Hashwolf. I was ordered to bring him to His Majesty. And only His Majesty. Ichigo could feel the tension in the air. He wondered if the 2 were going to fight over something so ridiculous. The door to the throne room was only a few feet away. It's not as if they had to journey further. I am fully aware of the mission. I can take it from here, replied the Grandmaster. Quilge Opie did not respect the second in command. He never acknowledged him, or bothered to speak to him in a friendly manner in any way, shape, or form. The jail had 2 options: he could ignore the second in command and proceed, or he could sit back and do as told. He wasn't in the mood to take chances. The black-haired Sternritter gave one last nod to Ichigo before vanishing before their eyes. Ichigo was disappointed. He was actually hoped the 2 Sternritter would fight. He had seen Jay fight, but he was eager to see how he could compete against the Grandmaster. Sternritter B stared down, and waited a few moments before snapping back into reality. The majority of the Sternritter never gave him the respect he felt he deserved. Even if Yawach himself had instructed everyone to respect him in the same way they respected their king. But no one really cared, and that frustrated the balance internally frustrated. Hello, my name is Jagram Hashwolf. I am the Sternritter Grandmaster, and second in command. He gave an optimistic smile to Ichigo, and held out his hand. Ichigo took his hand and shook it. Kurosaki Ichigo, he replied with a friendly nod. Welcome, Ichigo. Let us see the future together. The Grandmaster walked toward the large door. He placed his hand on one of the symbols and waited as a bright light began streamed across the massive structure. Ichigo stood next to him and was amazed to see such a unique and beautiful design glow before his eyes. The 2 then walked down the vast, open hallways of Silburn. Many more designs were painted along with an occasional statue of Yawach or perhaps another legendary Quincy who seemed to be long forgotten by the current generation. Oh! His legs tensed, his mind froze. Ichigo's eyes widened, full of shock and anxiety, as he looked at the side of the wall. The memorial was in place, but for whatever reason it was dedicated to someone that was never even declared dead. Before Jagram Hashwolf could notice his strange attitude, Ichigo quickly reassured himself it was nothing and quickened his pace. He knew that not one suspicious detail should not go unannounced. He had recognized who B was, as Bez described him multiple times. This was the guy he wanted dead more than Yawach, a traitor in his eyes. Right now Ichigo did not care for such a thing. Go in, I will close the door behind us. Usually, I like to get to know someone on a better level, but you do not know how long we have been trying to search for you, he said before heading back. Ichigo watched as the man suddenly revealed 2 invisible large racier doors which only came to light the moment he placed his palm onto him. The Grandmaster gave one last nod before shutting the boy inside. Ichigo turned back around but was confused as the area in front of him was pitching black. It was darker than coal, and scarier than being alone in the night. Yet, somehow, he could make out a few white orbs with black dots in the center of them. They were all closely together. He could remember what they were from way back. They were those mysterious pupils which glowed in the abyss. It felt like an eternity as Yawach kept his gaze on him. Are you afraid of the dark? Yawach finally spoke. His pupils receded back into their original form. He snapped his fingers and ignited as small bits of fire began across the room. They were bright enough to illuminate the entire throne, him, and Yawach himself. He looked just as he remembered him from 4 years ago. Ichigo did not respond. Rather, he seemed more interesting in staring at the man. Despite the fact they met only once and only for a brief moment, he felt as if he knew Yawach better than he knew himself. I see you're injured. It frustrates me that they tend to ignore me when I am not present. Ichigo flinched. And no, I challenged them first. I was unaware of their intentions. They attacked the town I was in. Yawach smirked. You challenged them? How amusing. I apologize for not bringing you here immediately. How was life in the Lichtracht? The Lichtracht was also to be known as the Northern Lands. These lands were part of the world that was only accessible for the Quincy. It was where the majority of the Quincy lived with those who did not escape to the human world. Not many had the means to do so, so they were forced to live in the seemingly infinite forest world. When Yawach sent him there, it brought him bonded with his Quincy roots. As he had lived for 8 years as a human, Yawach felt he would need at least a few years of experience living in where most of the Sternritter came from. This way, he was able to develop even the most basic skills such as dealing with other Quincy the same way he learned how to deal with humans in the real world. This, of course, was planned, as he himself would not have much time dealing with someone so young. Gathering a professional army weighed down on the Quincy king, and as much as he would have enjoyed raising Ichigo from the start, he felt no other option was available. It was fine, Ichigo mumbled quietly. Yawach raised an eyebrow and stood up. He panicked. Everything was okay, I learned a lot from being around others. The tone shifted into a sharper and confident mark. Yawach always gave off and intimidated him. He intimidated everyone Quincy, Shinigami, human, hollow, anything that could breathe could feel the power of Yawach gave off to the world. Ichigo had already met Yawach, but he did not fear him. The black-haired man placed his hand on Ichigo's shoulder and looked down. Tell me, are you all right? Ichigo was about to repeat his previous answer, but he knew Yawach could see right through him. It was true. Ichigo was not feeling optimistic or comfortable about the future. There were many things wrong with the situation. First, he felt alone. He worried about Basbi and Meninus since he didn't know what happened to them. Ichigo knew they were strong on their own, but he could not help but wonder if Meninus would make it out okay, though he was sure Baz could survive on his own. The stress from this was nerve-wracking. He considered those two to be the closest things he had to family, and not knowing if they were even alive was starting to get to him. He wasn't thinking as hard as he could have when he accepted extradition to the Vandenrake. Then there was the memorial he saw in the hallway. Ichigo was filled with enough anxiety to cause normal people to succumb to the stress, not to mention the fact that everything around him changed in a blink of an eye. It was terrifying to him. He had spent the last 2 years doing the same thing, living in the same spot, and now on this one particular day it all came to an end. He had learned to work well under pressure, but this was too much. If it hadn't been for the fact that it is Yawach who was there, and not someone who was a complete stranger, he might have cracked under the heavy force. It was now that he finally realized that his world was being turned in another direction, and he had no control over it. The fact that it took a small army to seek him out meant there was no way he was going to be able to decide much a future from here on out. This anxiety rushed the beating of his heart, made it hard to breathe. Ichigo, everything will be okay. Everything will be okay. Those words caught his attention. Where had he heard those words before? He looked up to Yawach with widened eyes. He had not heard the combination of those words in a long time. They made him feel better almost immediately. Those words had a long history behind them, but he could not seem to figure it out. Do you know why she died? She? It was now when Ichigo put the pieces together. His mother, she died. It is not as if he had forgotten, but this was the first time in many years where he recalled things prior to going to Lichtricht. He couldn't believe she was still dead. It was not something he enjoyed thinking about. It was his mind that repressed it. His eyes reddened and he hung his head down in sadness. Ah, sweetie, everything will be okay. The nostalgia hit hard. He wished she was with him right now. He wished she would say that, take his hand, and then go home. Could it happen? Was that still a possibility? He would like to know. He would do anything to know. Even if there was a small chance, it would be worth the risk. Being around Yawach, it reminded him strangely of his human past. One grievance is all you need. Do not be so sad, Ichigo. Do you believe she died so that you could be so sad? The question given by Yawach was replayed in Ichigo's mind. Of course she never wanted to see him sad. She proved beyond a shadow of a doubt she only wanted him to be happy. He knew of this, but it was hard for him not to be sad. She was gone forever, and he could only hope that he will see her again one day. He wanted to toughen up, but just this one time he decided to not give in. I will say it once more, everything will be okay. She died for you to walk, to breathe, to fight, and to love. You are young, so I cannot expect you to understand. He had been missing that part of his heart. His father, his mother, his sisters, they were all gone. The friends he had made were only there to fill the void in his chest. Without them, he felt alone. Even right now, at this very moment, he felt much hollower than ever before. Ichigo missed the things that made him who he was, his loving family. Fortunately for him, he had full confidence in what Quilge had promised. That if they were strong, in which they were, he would see them again. It was unclear on why he believed the man's words. Perhaps he wanted to believe them and that helped influence his overall mindset. You are fragile, but that is not a surprise. I used to be like you. In fact, I'm more like you than we both realize. There is a special connection between you and me, not as my other half, but in a more spiritual way. Ichigo looked up at him after he heard his words. He didn't know why, whether it was because he had Yhwach's blood flowing through his veins, or rather something much deeper, but he felt a connection to the man similar to that he had with his own parents. Was it because he saved his life, or because he reminded him of some comforting words that his mother used to tell him? Or perhaps because his aura radiated strength similar to that of his father? He did not know the answer. Ichigo, I want you to look at all of this as yours. I want you to love this empire which I have built. It is filled with people like yourself, brothers and sisters who have lost it all. I want you to love them and to protect them in the name of the Quincy race. This is your new home. It is called Silburn, and it is within Vandenrake City. He pondered at the thought of a new home. Optimism was a natural strong trait he possessed, and he could only hope this new home would feel like his old one. It was worth giving a shot. I want to join, he declared with a confident expression. You wish to what? I wish dash. You cannot wish for such a thing, Yhwach interrupted. You must earn it. Prove me to you can lead, that you can fight for the Vandenrake. He yelled. Ichigo nodded his head and smiled. He wiped the tears from his eyes and backed away from Yhwach. He had confidence in himself. It was the one thing Baz seemed to have given him, and he needed it now more than ever. Then I will. The declaration left a smile on the king's face. He placed his hand on Ichigo's hair and ruffled once more before turning him around. Go then. Hashwalth will instruct you from here on out. I will monitor your progress, so show me what you can do, my son, born in darkness. Ichigo had an eccentric expression on his face now. Someone placed their faith in him, and the last thing he wanted was to disappoint. The young Quincy left the room and walked toward the Grand Master who was leaning on the wall outside. Just far enough to the point where he could not hear what happened inside. Jagram was surprised to see the sudden change in Ichigo's posture. From an anxious, young child to a boy full of hope and excitement, Sternritter peeked inside and stared at the Emperor before giving a nod. He was curious to know what happened, but he knew what Yhwach wanted. The blonde-haired Quincy now walked next to Ichigo and kept a close watch over him. He made sure to focus on his charge, as he had noticed something strange the first time they walked through the hallway. The Grand Master suddenly stood in place and looked at the side of the hallway. Oh yes, he truly did see everything. He wondered what had stirred him up when they first passed it. It was nothing special, just a simple memorial on the wall that dedicated itself to the stepping stones of the Vandenrake. Still, he could not understand why it had shocked Ichigo to such a degree. Jagram never really got to know the person behind for whom the memorial was dedicated. He had only briefly known him but was curious to know what had occurred. Either way, Ichigo was now leading him by a good distance. The man simply shrugged and walked forward. First vice-captain of the Sternritter, Hubert, he stood before Yhwach. The king patiently sat in his chair. He had very relaxed and calm expression on his face as he stared at Ichigo. Hashwalth remained in the shadows nearby and kept a close eye on Ichigo. Jagram was grateful Ichigo was able to solve the 5 headaches that had plagued his poor mind just a few hours ago. We shall depart tomorrow morning, stated Yhwach. You are coming as well? Ichigo was as sharp as ever. Yhwach lifted his body up and rested it on the chair. I wish to fight this Queen of Las Noches myself. You already know the reason why we were going, so I need to demonstrate out my own power to set an example. Now, Ichigo could understood. He was going as part of the vanguard in Hueco Mundo while the king would challenge the leader of the Arrancar. Las Noches. It left a sting in Ichigo's mind. He had been there before. I have assembled a certain group. Sternritter J will be the one occupying the fortress while you and I are gone. His words seemed official, but Ichigo was irritated to know the man had forgotten about what they had discussed earlier. He waited until Yhwach finished his speech. I had promised Sternritter Z as well as E that they will be accompanying us as well. Ichigo was not afraid to speak up. He shouldn't be. It could be said that he was a favorite of the king. Still, he showed his respect. Yhwach lowered his eyes. Fine, but they are your responsibility. He stood and recalled the words from Basby. Ichigo only wondered on how such a thought was possible. The man was a monstrosity of power. Right now, Ichigo could only dream about overcoming him someday. Staring at himself through a mirror, he believed his uniform was very well designed. It was the most basic in the Vandenrake, but it suited his own interests. This type of uniform was the same soldat would typically wear. However, Ichigo did not have the gas mask as he did not need such a thing. It had only been a few minutes after his first meeting with Yawach that he was shown to his small room by Hashwalth. He was not given a room in Silbern. That was only for the Sternritter and the Quincy King. Ichigo was now residing alongside the standard soldat within the barracks of the lower Wandenrake city. You will be placed into a special program. It is designed for those with higher potential than others. The Balance had been observing his idle stance for some time. There are not many others in this program. After all, it is very difficult. Ichigo believed his warning and only stared at the room. He had just arrived, but the Grand Master wished personally to show him around. I won't be training with the other soldat? The Wandenrake used strange words to describe things. Ichigo was a little disappointed. It was always more fun training with a group of people rather than being alone. It always put a lot of stress as he knew he would have to impress his trainer. No, you will be training with a Sternritter. Follow me. The blond man led Ichigo out of the room and out back into the hallway. The Quincy who often hung around this area all dispersed at the sight of the man as being caught lounging around was a serious punishment. Feel free to socialize with others. It is important, but try not to obtain their habits. You are expected to be much better than that. His nod seemed to assure the second in command. Ichigo had been very observant and respectful towards Jagram. He always paid attention and made sure to follow him accordingly. It was actually rare for such politeness to be shown towards the Grand Master. The Sternritter never showed their gratitude, or even consideration for Hashwalth existing. He was just the guy who enforced the rules among the elite Quincy, and that was bound to never be liked. This of course led to resentment among him and the people he was forced to confront. Ichigo, however, was a different story. It could be that he is young, or perhaps new to the Wandenrake, but it made Jagram feel a bit better knowing someone respected him. He only could hope it would last. The two left the barracks and headed outside into the city. Not many wanted to confront the two. The area is always much more massive once you are within its compound. Ichigo was surprised to see how such an area was constructed. Never before in the Lichtricht has he seen anything remotely similar. Majority of towns or the rare site of a large city was mainly fragile wood. Stone castles were often abandoned or destroyed. At least he knows now who destroyed them. He was briefed on Hashwalth on how his normal routine would play out. Very early in the morning would he awake to do exercises alongside the soldat. This would prepare his body for the later training with the Sternritter. At least I will be prepared. This is by design. Ichigo looked at him with confusion. The man sighed. That is a lie. The Sternritter are already trained and do not have to wake up at any point during the day as long as they attend the required events. The younger Quincy pondered his words. So it's more of a punishment if they train me? This worried him greatly. He gave another sigh. They will see it that way, yes. These types of orders come directly from His Majesty, so they will respect that. But they will certainly not enjoy it. And since some of the more obedient ones are always performing other tasks, we only pick the ones that need more discipline. Ichigo was unnerved to hear such a thing. That means whoever will be instructing him would be someone who really wouldn't wish to be there. Obviously, there would be a lack of progress and more of a shit getting the kicked out of him scenario. That would happen either way regardless. Are Sternritter really strong? The question was a bit strange to hear. Obviously, the Sternritter were very strong. Hashwalth just knew Ichigo was a bit nervous for the future encounter. Do not worry. We have faith in you. But do not ever hold back against them. The words eased Ichigo as he sighs in relief. As long as he knew he had a chance, he felt he could win any fight. Or so he thought. The two now turned into a corner which revealed a hot spot for many soldat. There were many benches and chairs which were scattered across this major court. Small buildings all had signs with different food and drinks labeled which catered to everyone. Ichigo was not hungry, but some of the more sweets sounded very delicious. He noticed that the seating had also been split. On the lower end of the court were many soldat who had their gas masks taken off and were enjoying themselves in delight. He then looked up to the higher areas of the court, which had one large staircase that ascended to the upper levels of the area. When looking up, he could see only one person sitting in the higher levels. It was a blonde female who wore a small Wandenrake Sternritter cap. Judging from the amount of plates, she was at least eating with a group of 4 people. But as he continued to watch, she was just eating everything off of all the plates. Huh! His eyes darted around and he was stunned to see another figure. This one was much taller, and was completely bald. He seemed to have a strange third eye in the middle of his forehead. The Sternritter area was almost as large as the soldat one, yet those were the only 2 people there. These 2 Quincy had not even recognized one another. Despite them clearly being alone, they would rather sit by themselves rather than speak. Don't go up there. Jagram instructed, it is for the stern ritter only. They are forced to eat here since many cannot clean up the messes they make in Silburn. Ichigo nodded and stared ahead to all the friendly soldat who all seemed to like one another. There wasn't any bickering or backlash between each other. They all knew they were friends in the military who could only enjoy the basic things in life. I think I'd rather be down here than up there anyways. It looks lonely up there, and weird. That is quite humble. Do you wish to get anything before we leave? He didn't really think it was humble to choose that option. Majority of the sternritter thought hanging around with soldat is often seen as a negative. As why would someone affiliate themselves with the lower class? But in reality it truly was because the soldats seemed to have been enjoying themselves much more than the two sternritter who refused to even acknowledge one another. Ichigo shook his head and the two then proceeded to leave the food court. Haschwalth then guided Ichigo towards the outskirts of the city, and told him how the cold wind acts as a defense for Silburn. The city itself was the same size as Seoul society, which was still something Ichigo had barely any knowledge of. In due time you will know about the history between Quincy and Shinigami. I understand you were raised a human and do not have any real knowledge on what actually happened. The war was obviously something in which everyone knew. However, since majority of Quincy had died, it was difficult to amount the entire pure destruction which was inflicted on the Quincy race. These types of drills were prominent into confining the Quincy to hate the Shinigami as they prepared to gather an army for another war. It is late, the Grand Master said. Ichigo titled his head. It's still pretty bright outside. It's late. His Majesty is still recovering some of his powers, and that requires a lot of sleep. When His Majesty does sleep, this world becomes dark and very cold. That's why it is important to try and get much done as early as possible. At any moment now His Majesty could feel the need to rest. The explanation surprised Ichigo. That meant Yhwach himself powered this world through his own soul. When he slept, so did the world. And when he was awoken, then could he come to Wandenrake's city once more. How did you join the Wandenrake? I was curious. The question was sudden and unexpected. However, Jagram did not see any reason not to explain his story. The older man began explaining more about himself. Despite this, Ichigo knew the man was lying from the beginning. The balance explained on how Yhwach saved him from his burning village that was caused by Shinigami, when in reality it was the Quincy king who he himself had set. Yugo then explained how his uncle was the person who took care of him since his birth, and had tried raising him alone. Ichigo was a bit saddened to hear that he skipped out everything that happened between from his village burning and joining Yhwach. Basby was not mentioned in this story. The Grand Master then praised Yhwach on how well he was able to raise his second-in-command. How all of his skill and strength all came from fighting alongside the Quincy leader. Jagram had spent his entire life and has dedicated everything he could on to ensuring it would last. All the powers he had been given from Yhwach were a gift, and not something he must take for granted. Ichigo was silent during his explanation since he was interested about the man. In fact, Ichigo was curious about practically everyone he had come across, always wanting to know how they ended up here of all places. But despite his surprise, he could not help but be excited. He had mixed feelings on the whole issue, but he was excited to be a part of something big. A professional military was something that he could be proud of, not to mention he enjoyed the style. The two headed down multiple streets, and before they knew it they were both walking back into the barracks. Ichigo now stood and faced Haschwalth. The man seemed a bit distressed as he prepared to leave back to Silburn. He opened the door for Ichigo but placed his hand on his shoulder. Tomorrow you will be training with a Sternritter as I promised. But I do thank you for being the way you are. And I do sincerely apologize for who you will be against. If I could choose someone else, I really would. I will see you later, have a nice sleep. At least he is nice about it. The warning did not startle Ichigo as he was already prepared from the day. He entered the room and quickly discarded his uniform. It was such a relief to rest his body onto the bed. He had been walking throughout the whole day, which was actually pretty exhausting considering how massive Wandenrake City was. Ichigo had not met anyone new, but had learned about where everything he needed would be. His only complaint was the fact that he was missing two people who were very dear to him. Baz. He was worried for the two. Ichigo had yet to see any mention of his friends and was getting worried at every minute. Even if Quilge had promised if they were worth it they would come here, the nerve was still unsettling. Basby should have no problem, but it was really about Meninas who he was thinking about. She was strong, stronger than Ichigo at this time, but lacked the will to fight on her own accord. She was not bloodthirsty like Baz was. I guess we'll just see. Hey, can you shut up? What was that? Ichigo's eyes shot up wide as they stared down a person from above. The moment was so shocking that he actually shook to the side and had fallen out of his bed. Acting on instinct, his body shot back up and took a few steps back. "Who the hell are you?" he asked with a ferocious expression. The other boy lowered his eyes. "Who the hell am I?" "Who the hell are you?" "I've been in this same room for years." Ichigo's expression went low. "Oh, is that why there are bunk beds?" The man nodded. "Sorry, I didn't see anyone here earlier, so I assumed I was going to be alone." He quickly got back into the bed and sighed. The adrenaline from being so shocked had his heart racing, and as he was no longer tired, the person above him could not have been much older than Ichigo. He had a notable scar on his face and had shaggy black hair. "I was out fighting a Sternritter." The gasp wasn't surprising. "Look, I'm tired as hell right now. And before you ask, yes, they are strong, but just keep cool and make sure to dodge everything. Counter-attacking is pointless unless you know how to use blood artery." Ichigo frowned. "Oh well, what's your name?" "Call me Tsangdu. There aren't many of us in this little program, so I guess it will be good to know you as well." He smiled. "Kurosaki Ichigo." "Well, Ichigo, hopefully you don't die tomorrow." Now he was more unsettled. "Ichigo." The Sternritter was awoken to the snapping fingers of the iron. The Asian-looking man looked a bit irritated, as he seems to have been trying to call him for quite some time. "You there?" "We're waiting." Ichigo flinched and looked around. Giselle and Bambietta were both leaning against a tree while Quilge and Yawach were discussing matters regarding the Jagrani. "You're leading this, remember? Why am I daydreaming about men?" Ichigo frowned. "Yeah, let's go." He had chosen to bring Tsangdu for only a few simple reasons. The man was, for starters, a quiet person. This saves Ichigo the headache of having to deal with someone who would constantly annoy him or bicker about stupid things. Compared to the rest of the male Sternritter, the iron was quite likable. The man was certainly reliable and could be trusted when it came to keeping secrets. Due to this, Ichigo had thought he was the best candidate for their assignment. He also doesn't run his mouth to others. Yawach was not the person instructing on how to invade Las Noches. He had purposely brought Ichigo to the Hollow World for the sole purpose of guiding him towards the Queen of Hueco Mundo. The Quincy Emperor only wished to fight this queen himself. He did not have time to plan out such an invasion, and time was limited for everyone. This was only supposed to take an hour at the most. If they bothered ever listening to Ichigo, Quilge adjusted his glasses. "Well, Kurosaki? Lead the way." The man was a bit annoyed that Ichigo would be in charge for this mission. Although he could not be too upset, the jail was going to be the leading force in occupying the fortress. He will finally be away from Silbern. "Thank Kami," Ichigo sighed. "Fine. Let's go then." The group consisted of only Bambietta, Quilge, Tsang, Giselle and Yawach. The force was small, but strong enough to be reckoned with and more than enough to deal with the remaining Espada. The Schutzstaffel member led the group into the forest of Minos, but was surprised to see that none of the Hollow were trying to harm them. "Don't kill them. If you do, Soul Society will be aware of the events." Yawach smirked at Ichigo's tactic. The cloaks they all wore was specifically designed just so Hollows will not become a threat. There would be no need to inform them just yet. This way they are able to attack Las Noches without having to deal with Hollows in which Soul Society will know that disappeared. It would be disastrous if the Godai 13 were to be aware of the Wandenreika's plans before formally declaring war. Tsangdu kept a close eye on Ichigo. He had grown up in the Quincy Empire alongside his friend, and together the two were closing during their progress. They would often train against each other to test one another, and to ensure they would be prepared for the upcoming war. This of course led to some obscure tension between Ichigo's male friends, and a few particular female friends. The Iron was great at observing everything which went on within Wandenreik. This gave him a great sense on how his old bunk mate would be able to interact with other Sternritter. However, not everyone enjoyed their closeness. Some other Quincy had disproved Ichigo's affiliation with some other people, and that led to infighting. The others, of course, being Quincy he did not trust. It was not paranoia for some to be weary of other Quincy within the Wandenreik. Rather, it was something which everyone should be aware of. It wasn't often, but every now and then somehow a Sternritter would go missing. Either on a mission, or rather sometimes just randomly one night they disappear. This would cause mass confusion, but normally nobody cared enough to do such an investigation. Tsangdu was weary of one particular Quincy on this mission. Many not believe it, but this person was a master of disguise. He stared at the two strand hairpieces which stood like antennae. The strands connected to the head, which was covered by straight, long black hair. The gaze in which he gave this person was a narrowed cold stare. Giselle Gawel was one Sternritter which he did not trust, and the fact that Ichigo was so willing to be with her at any point in time was troubling. Luckily for him, he was not the only one who thought this. "You're going to Hueco Mundo? He picked you of all people?" "PSSH, just here to rub it in." "No, I came to tell you about something." "She is going, and I'm wondering on why he picked her and not you. A skin Naklovar sighed and leaned against the hallway. This was the person who was most skeptical of the Sternritter. Sang and Askin never really talked much until the Iron started noticing the faultiest within the Wandenrake. It started happening when one mysterious Sternritter had joined the ranks, and he never really got over it. The two followed Yawach and his decisions but were more concerned with the internal strife which was seemingly out of his control. So why didn't you ask him? The death-dealing asked with an irritated tone. He would just give me some stupid answer. He doesn't even acknowledge the suspicions surrounding her. Sang had gotten frustrated from his friend's lack of care. Ichigo normally would scoff of any attempt to try and sway him away from Giselle. Askin lowered his eyes. She is dangerous. I'll try and get others but don't tell Hashwalth yet. Keep an eye on Ichigo, and her. As long as he doesn't know you have a problem with her he won't mind you tagging along. Sung now watches with a blank expression on his face as the zombie waves to him. She had noticed his staring for quite some. This, along with her smile, was just another attempt for her to try and get him off her back. This was not the first time she was being quietly pressed about her integrity within the Wandenrake. But he would simply budge off of her. The girl was just too suspicious to be left alone. Giselle Gawel was no doubt one of the more cunning and more intelligent Sternritter. Her appearances and personality made it seem contradictory. However, it was something that which only few could see through. Her look back was met with a reaction with only irritated song. The girl suddenly leaped from her position and grappled on the person leading the group. Ichigo suddenly stops when a heavy force comes onto him from behind. The Quincy could feel the soft hands of Giselle wrap around his neck from behind. My feet hurt. She explained. Ichigo simply nodded and held onto her wrists. Naturally, the girl took advantage of the situation and had begun teasing her Sternritter comrades. Sun only shook his head in disapproval as he could not believe his friend would even be remotely affiliated with someone like her. She of course looked back to see him one last time to rub it in. Her feet always seemed to hurt. Bambietta did not seem to show any reaction. She stood at side with Yawach as the two began observing their surroundings. It was quite tense being in this forest for at any moment they have no idea if something unexpected might come at them. She would often check up on her female friend who was just hanging on to the Schutzstaffel member. Giselle had a tendency to do whatever it took to annoy her female de facto leader. But she was too focused to care about such events. The Explode was doing utmost best to prove to Yawach she can handle herself. This wasn't anything new. The Emperor had promised many of the Sternritter a fortunate life if they were able to meet his difficult requests. The group is eventually led outside of the immense forest, and can now see in the far distance the fortress. The area is massive, much more massive than Silvern, said Ichigo as everyone narrows their eyes. The group begins heading out but we're surprised to see that no matter how far they seem to have traveled, the distance keeps being the same. This of course led some to speculate that it truly could be far away, and that they may even need to set up camp. The leader of the plan was simply observing the area. He had no intention of staying here for more than an hour as that is all the time Yawach had given him. It is an illusion. In reality it would take us 3 normal days to get there. There were sudden gasps among the group but no one complained that hard since the Emperor was standing before them. Ichigo reached downwards and pressed his palm against the sand. A giant black shadow sprung around from his body and began approaching his fellow Quincy. They all remained calm as their bodies began to descend into the Shatten Breach. All of the Quincy would remain within Ichigo's shadow until he was able to come closer to the fortress. Using his own power, Ichigo sprung out another shadow and was able to see where he wished to go. The teen soon fell backwards into the sand and was soon cleared from sight. The shadow region was something he had become excelled in wondering. It did not take long before a clad-hooded figure was seen rising from the shadow of the immense Las Noches walls. He stood out, and quickly placed his palm against the wall. Ichigo watched calmly as 4 Quincy and the Emperor himself were seen walking out of the wall. They all seemed to be amazed on how purely massive the fortress was. The walls were much larger than anything else than the ones in Silburn or the Siriidii. Your Verker is impressive. I did not expect you to have the strength to transport even me. Yawach rarely praised people on their skills. It was rather something he did about their accomplishments just moments before killing them. But it was a surprise. Very rarely did Yawach ever come from other shadow users. It was told that before Ichigo, no one even had the strength to lift his majesty from the realm. Shatten Verker, shadow traffic, was the name of Ichigo's ability. It was the method of creating a shadow, and then transporting large groups of Sternritter. It was much different than the standard use of shadows, as these Quincy were a lot stronger than regular soldat who could come from anyone's usage of the ability. The ability Ichigo used to travel the massive distance was called Shatten-Gihen, Shadow Walk. If an area was an eye's distance and was casting a shadow of its own, he is able to transport himself into the Shatten breach and invade the object's space. This method is used for infiltration. Since his body cannot be detected, any alarms will not be triggered. Ichigo is literally teleporting to another dimension, running through it, and rising through the same dimension into the shadow of Lost No Chase. "It's dark in there!" exclaimed Giselle as he leaps onto him once more, and cold added, sighing as his body was coated in goosebumps. "Ichi-chan, Bambi-chan is shivering. She needs a hug." Ichigo smirked and looked down to the other female. "Is that true, Bambi-chan? Do you need a hug?" The female Sternritter only eyed and kept a calm composure, but he was a bit startled at her cold dark stare. She never enjoyed being teased and was only giving him a warning by not saying anything. Ichigo joked and began walking towards her, but the moment he was close she pulled out a sharp blade. "Get away from me," she warned. Ichigo and Giselle laughed while the other Quincy grew impatient. "I was just being nice. Can we speed this up? Not everyone has time for your insolence," yelled the jail. Ichigo sighed and placed his hand against the wall. "There is no formal entrance. All of the Espada and Arrancar reside in palaces scattered across. This is the northern entrance, and leads to majority of the areas." His explanation was impressive. Ichigo supposedly has only come to Lost No Chase only once. He looked to Yawatch to see what he wished to do. The Emperor sprung a razor broadsword from his hip. "I will be at the roof. Bring this Queen of Hueco Mundo to me for judgment." The group watched as the Quincy King ascended up onto the wall. His speeds were accelerated by his ability to manipulate the more potent razor that is present within the hollow world. "Show off." Ichigo looked to Quilge. "Go west and see if any come to approach you. I highly doubt they were just going to hide in the fortress. And if they do, we will just bring them out. I don't want anyone going inside, for there is certainly going to be traps." The man gave a reluctant nod and headed off. This would hopefully be the last time he would have to hear an order from Ichigo of all people. The Shustaffel member then looked at two other Quincy. "Go east, Giselle. And Sung, make sure she's alright." It was not as if he believed the zombie was weak. It was rather the fact on how much he considered her power to be a wild card. Having just one other Sternritter nearby would be enough to soothe his thoughts, as then Giselle could easily attract and manipulate more enemies. Giselle always needs someone around just in case they figure out her ability. "You're joking?" the Iron asked. "Yeah, I'm just messing around, right?" Ichigo sighed. "Just be in the area." Sung seemed unconvinced. Ichigo knew he wouldn't do as he asked. "Now." Sung sighed before quickly walking off into the direction. Of course he wasn't going to simply oblige, he couldn't care if anything happened to Giselle. "Now for the last one." "Where should I go?" Bambietta asked. Her tone was expressionless, but in reality she was hoping for something more fitting than to go one way. He of course knew this and wished to give her something worth her skill. "As if I have a real choice," he smirked. "The corners of the fortress could easily fall. I want you to destroy the fortress. That way the fighting would end much quicker." The task was exciting for the Explode. She smiled and gave him a confident nod. Just the thought of destroying this massive complex was driving up her desire to unleash her maximum potential power. Ichigo now sighed and frowned. His job was going to simply be extracting. The Quincy placed his open palm on the wall and began pushing forward. Before he knew it, his body had walked right into the palace unopposed. He of course had the most boring job of them all. There had been a time once where he stood in the exact spot. Considering the situation back then, he was much more prone to vulnerability and fear. His affiliation now in the ranks now has set him in a position much higher than originally anticipated. The Sternritter briefly sunk into the past memories. It had been 2 years since the day he first arrived in his fortress. He had learned a lot since then, and one of those things was thinking that the thought of being afraid of the future was as useless as it sounded. It was not worth the time or effort to even give it a single thought. This was what laid his foundation to becoming one the strongest Quincy to be in the Empire, and so he quickly discarded the past feeling. He had snuck into this fortress on his own accord. Standing alone, he was forced to cut down any being who tried to attack him in any way. They were not other Quincy, or Shinigami, they were in fact hollows, Arrancar, as they preferred to have been called. But it did not matter what they really were. All that mattered is that he felt compelled to cut them down or be forced to not fight at all. He was an elite Sternritter. Being part of Schutzstaffel made him held to such a high regard that even the slightest mess-up could be the biggest failure. He was what the regular Sternritter all looked up to. This gave him something to be proud of in his own way. But this day was bound to come. And so the stern Ritter who he himself had chosen all prepared for the invasion of Hueco Mundo. This was something which majority of the Quincy did not believe to actually be essential. In fact, majority of the stern Ritter liked the Arrancar, for them having to challenge the Goti 13 in the same way they were planning to. Yawach never really explained in detail why it was so important to have the area to himself. If anything, it was just unnecessary bloodshed on the Wandenreika's side. Of course, Ichigo knew the true intention behind his king's mind. He wondered if he should just leave right now, and hope that Yawach could never find out. The person who faces him down could not see his face. Ichigo was wearing the hooded coat with a black mask. However, unknowing to him, the person could easily tell by his power who he was. It was as if the figure had once faced him before. He looked to his left, and then to his right. The room was empty. He looked down to see one body on the floor, panting in pain. He had not killed her, rather simply incapacitated her to such a degree to where she could no longer stand on two legs. A clean cut in the right spot did the job just right. Ichigo was not a sadist, so he had tried his best to at least make the area as least painful as possible. The person on the floor was a female. He did not know her name. She had short, brown hair which stood up. She was wearing a female-styled Arrancar uniform. She attacked me first. The moment he had arrived, she attacked him. It was only natural to defend himself. Luckily, he believed she was not all that powerful. There is no need to worry, Minoli, spoke the figure who was staring Ichigo down. The figure also happened to be a female. This one had shaggy blonde hair with a zip-up top which covered practically her entire face. She sat calmly in a massive throne chair. One much larger than Yawach has. They will all perish. Her name was Tia Halibel. She was known in the Dayton as the Queen of Hueco Mundo. De facto, of course, no one in Seoul society had recognized this in the terms of peace during their ending war. Yes, Halibel-sama were Minoli words before collapsing unconscious onto the ground. She gave one last disgusted look towards the Quincy before shutting her eyes. Behind his mask, Ichigo lowered his eyes. Still as arrogant as ever, he said in a calm tone. The Queen kept her composure, and was unfazed by the comment. She sat up. Arrogance? I think not. You come here with your army and expect us to submit. You are the arrogant one here. Ichigo was annoyed to admit it, but she did in fact have a point. Before the invasion, it was no surprise that the Wandenreich had simply asked the Hollows to oblige and to submit under the Quincy name. I have given you multiple warnings. If you don't submit, everyone will die. Even the ones you care about. Ichigo knew she could see him through the mask. Even if it wasn't physically possible, she had felt his power. He discarded the mask and pushed down his hood. She was surprised to see he had revealed his face, but she did not really care either. It all seemed to not matter. Don't let your pride blind you. There are truly scary things that aren't worth it. She lowered her eyes. And you will be this fear? I'm not the one you should be scared of. She was a bit at odds with his reply. From now she knew he did not come to intend to fight. Yawach had strict orders that he would be the one to combat the Queen of Hueco Mundo. His job was to simply be his bodyguard during the escort. In the span of a blink of an eye, the atmosphere had changed. The Queen drew her unique Zanpakuto and had clashed downwards from above. Ichigo sighed and formed his spirit weapon. His preferred weapon was a longer version of a Chinese-styled dao with an eagle cross at the cross handle. Every time we meet, you always a different styled sword. Ichigo ignored the comment as the blade meet. Neither could feel the killing intent of one another. Bambietta copied me. Kurosaki Ichigo, she trailed off with a low tone. Although he could not see it, she was smirking under that hollow mask. Now that I think about it, you two do look alike. Ichigo flared in shock and continued to press the attack. Clashing blades was something he had become proficient at. Did you know at the first time we met? Is that why you never told me your name? Why would I blindly give out my name? He never told his enemies what his name was. Ichigo had always felt that one day that information would eventually come back to haunt him. He simply referred to his stern Ritter name, and that was usually enough to satisfy those he was fighting. Do not be upset. You should praise the man. I did give my own thanks. Ichigo spun around and dodged a clean slash. Halibel watched as her opponent leaped backwards and raised his hand up. She widened her eyes in confusion as her legs suddenly froze in place. Looking down, she sees two black arms reached out from the ground which were able to physically capture both her legs and keep her pinned to the floor. I'm lucky she only weighs 135 pounds. Ichigo sighed. I can't help you anymore. He has been waiting for you. I suggest you try and comply as much as you can. That way you and your precious comrades and live this out. It was obvious to know that these two had a past together. Ichigo did not wish to fight, and she wished to simply be left alone. However, the Wandenrake had assaulted Las Noches and the Espada. She felt the need to fight for them as she was the queen. Then after I kill him, I will come back to you. You once insulted me by not telling me your full name. While I have told you mine, Ichigo smirked. You first. My name is Tia Halbel, Queen of Hueco Mundo, and she began unzipping her face jacket. He was a bit weirded out by her need to reveal her large chest. The Primera Espada. Her title was precious. She had been the ruler over this land and kept this rank for over 2 years, ever since the Winter War in which majority of her fellow Espada had been killed by the Shinigami. But she could not hold much grudge from this. Was that really necessary? I would have believed her from the beginning. Kurosaki Ichigo's stern Ritter SS. A 2-letter script was unique. It did not stand for his rank as Schutzstaffel, but rather stood for 2 entirely different things, the S being its own, and the other S being another. He is the only one in the Wandenrake to have such an ordeal. Every other Quincy had one from A to Z, only Ichigo had a script that was not one ordinary letter. And only another Sternritter had a script outside the Latin alphabet. And what does that really mean? She questioned with a blank expression. I am the shadow and the spirit. She gripped her sword. Last time we fought you only had one S. Ichigo ignored the comment and prepared for his next move. The Queen of Hueco Mundo watched in surprise as a large shadow appeared from beneath Ichigo's feet. The sudden shadow then moved from his position and became attached to a nearby wall. The Quincy then appeared before the Queen and gripped her by the arm, still as gentle as ever. She spoke before feeling an upswing of strength. Ichigo had launched the girl into the shadow. Maybe because you'll cut me if I pull harder. He was lucky she was willing not to fight him at this moment. Yawach would have been pissed to know that Ichigo was going to fight her rather than himself. He sighed and placed another shadow on the floor. The Quincy watched as many Jagdami began flooding into the area. This is the throne room. Scatter out and search for any Arankar that may be hiding within. But keep a distance if it is an Espada. They followed the order and all lashed out into opposite directions. Las Noches was vast. It would take an army to scour the entire thing. Ichigo placed his palm against a nearby wall, and was last seen walking through it like a door. He did not wish to make Yawach wait long. Destruction, absolute destruction. Ichigo now appeared at the roof of Las Noches and studied the surrounding area. All the fighting during the invasion took place outside the major walls. Much of fortress had been destroyed by the advancing Wandenrake army. Yawach had placed an army of soldat just prior to the Sternritter assaulting the walls. Did you find the queen? Said a voice from behind. Ichigo turned around and stared at the floating king. The man seemed eager to do battle and had already drawn out his rapier broadsword. Ichigo nodded and slammed his foot into the ground. A forced shadow came to life which soon ejected out a blonde Espada. She seemed a bit phased at first. The area she had been in was not a comfortable one. Queen of the Hollows, I am king of the Quincy. Submit to us, and you shall receive your life. The comment simply angered Halibel. She didn't however express her emotion in such a way. The now Primera simply withdrew her hollow-styled blade and awaited the Quincy leader. Yawach simply narrowed his eyes and stared at Ichigo. Leave us, he ordered. His bodyguard sighed and nodded. Ichigo gave one last look to Halibel, who stared back at him. His body suddenly descended back into the ground as a large shadow engulfs his body. The moment she saw the destruction from the roof, her expression changed back into a much ferocious one. It was now she was fully ready to kill everyone she could. Don't say I didn't warn you. Bambietta Basterbine had an unusual fixation for absolute destruction. It was just so amusing to simply blow things into the near-molecular level. It brought her great joy to see how truly massive the fortress of Las Noches was. Silbern itself had paled in comparison. She was a bit annoyed to see how much better Hollows had lived compared to the Sternritter. Ichigo had explained that the Espada all lived in palaces. Palaces which were much more nicely designed and compact than even his own. In fact, his room couldn't even compare to how the Espada had lived. Hollows living better than Quincy greatly affected her desire to blow up Las Noches even further. The building was so massive it was difficult to actually make a difference. Using Hirenkyaku, she appeared into a corner of the fortress and unleashed a torrent of rapier. Portions of the structure would light up in smoke before erupting. Is that a sun? The Explode was a bit baffled to see that inside this dark world could exist a light powerful enough to shine an artificial sun. Hey bitch, quit blowing up the roof. That light will go away and we'll be stuck with this boring-ass moon. She darted her lowered eyes around and stared at the presence of another person. A grin formed on the Sturmritter's face. Bambietta took note of his strange appearance, and could tell he was a powerful Arankar himself. The Arankar was a tall male with jet-black light blue hair. He was wearing a black shirt with a white jacket along with black boots and 2 belts. A ferocious portion of a hollow mask was present on the right side of his face. But what had caught her attention the most was the strange-looking eye markings which trailed past his sky-blue eyes. She smirked. Cat? The observation had been spot on. He gritted his teeth. Hey. Let's just get this shit over with, girlie. I ain't got time to deal with you forever. Too many of you to cut down. Grimjow pulled his katana from his hip and raised it over his shoulder. The handle and sheath were both colored blue. The man seemed to have a somewhat code of honor as he waited until the Quincy was able to form her own spirit weapon. He seemed unimpressed by her short Dao-styled blade. I did not copy Ichigo. Come on, kitty! She taunted. The explode suddenly widened her eyes when a buzzing sound ringed into her ears. A slash downwards was barely enough to counter the sudden strike from the Arankar's blade. The two were able to get a feel for one another as blades constantly clashed into each other. Grimjow was not above fighting innocent-looking girls, but he could not take them as seriously as fighting another Espada or Shinigami, for example. She saw the look in his eyes. How lesser he considered the explode to be. She was getting pissed. Getting taken so lightly by someone who you deem as a barbaric creature talking down to you will not go so well with the Quincy. You're pretty cute. How about after this you and I head off to my palace? He asked. A ferocious grin formed onto his face. She cracked into laughter. With you. Grimjow cursed as she couldn't contain herself. You're just a little kitty. The Espada felt the atmosphere heat up as the Quincy began launching strands of rapier towards the Arankar. Naturally, the man defended himself and began swiping away at the rapier strikes. Grimjow was a natural predator, and had been born with characteristic like a panther. That came with some benefits. He had been blessed with a much stronger sense of acrobatics and hand-to-hand fighting. Speed had also been one of his strong suits, and then came the stronger sense of the smell. The moment fire ignited around him was the same moment he had reacted. Boom! A large explosion decimated a portion of the roof of Las Noches. Bambietta smirked in victory as she could now see the walls soon begin to crumble. Her smile soon fell flat as her opponent happened to be remaining idle. Grimjow was in no way in perfect shape. His reaction was quick enough to dodge the explosions which were centered on his legs. However, he had failed to realize that his own sword had been compromised with the Quincy's rapier. An explosion on his right hand had left the limb in dark burns. His sword was durable, and had survived the explosion. The man was bleeding all the way down from his right shoulder to his fingers. You are pretty tough, Hollow. She licked her lips. Maybe I will come with you to your palace. I don't know, what do you say, Kurosaki? Bambietta stared at Ichigo, who was standing on the ledge nearby. He had been watching ever since leaving the Queen and Yawatch to fight at the center of the roof in Las Noches. Ichigo sighed. Shut up, please. Bambietta shrugged. I mean, you and Giselle just have the time of your lives together. Ichigo could tell by her smile that she was joking. Sternritter never really cared about the things he and Giselle would do. You're her leader. Hey, I never insinuate that. In his defensive, Ichigo never did start those types of situations. She tilted her head. Oh really? Yes, really. Kurosaki spoke the Arankar. Before Ichigo could respond, the two looked over to the dispersing smoke. The Espada was breathing heavily and had his head lowered. However, he could still look up and stare at Ichigo with lowered eyes. Is that really you, Kurosaki? He asked. Grimjow tried containing himself. The bomb had basically affected the entire right side of his upper body. Bambietta smirked. This your boyfriend, Ichigo? Sounds like he missed you. As if I'd have a way better boyfriend if I wanted to. Why am I even thinking about that? Ichigo remained silent and lowered his eyes at the Espada. I asked you a question. Is that really you, Kurosaki? The Hollow leaped towards Ichigo at high speeds. Forming a spirit weapon was practically instant for Ichigo now. He had become proficient at forming his weapon. The two were going at it for quite a while. For whatever reason, the Arankar seemed upset with him. The look on his face and the way he battled was not smooth or rational. Relax, man. What's your problem? Sternritter SS asked. Grimjow stepped aside. My problem? What the fuck is your problem? The Hollow knew he could not beat the Quincy with simple sword combat. I mean, we all have problems. Boom. An unexpected explosion forced the two combatants to dash away. Don't steal my kill, Ichigo. Bambietta warned. Was spitting my name like that supposed to be a threat? Ichigo withdrew his sword and flashed towards Bambietta. He attacked me? Stern Rittery cursed him and searched around for her opponent. The hollow was now floating in the air just ahead of the two Quincy. Ichigo? The Arrancar asked with a surprised tone. Look at you weird? I ain't getting what you mean. I look at you like this because I didn't come here to fight you. I came to kill Aizen. You're a pretty tough guy and I wouldn't want to waste everything I have just yet. You don't like Aizen either but you're here to stop me? Ain't that funny? Ichigo tch, you're no Kurosaki. For a moment I thought you were worth something. The hollow snapped back to the female Quincy and leaped out with full killing intent. Bambietta smirked and began raising her own Ryatsu. This idiot hasn't even thought about my bombs, he just keeps coming. The female Quincy guided the fight towards the roof and began releasing Reisher in the area. Another attribute to her power is that she can do this while at the same fighting Grimmjow with her own sword. She flashed into the air and watched with absolute glory as the area of the roof erupted into a bright light. Complete destruction filled the roof. The fortress on the northwest corner was barely standing on its legs. Fuck! 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 The blue-haired Arrancar yelled as his body collapsed onto the remaining platform. Blood dripped all over his body. Bombs were a very powerful offensive which no one could handle. He did not have the best hierro and was lucky enough to have his limbs intact. These bombs could kill even Shinigami captains with ease. What's your name, kitty? He raised his head up with lowered eyes. At least she wanted to know out of respect, Grimmjow Jagerjax, he answered. Fourth Espada. It was hard for him to admit his rank after being taken down so easily. Well, kitty, but there was no way to beat me if you couldn't figure out my explode. I mean you're fast, but what the hell did you think you could outrun a bomb? She taunted. I can. He stood up. Why the fuck did you want my name if you wouldn't even use it? The man swiped blood from his wound and mixed it in his palm. Bambietta watched with impressed eyes as bright blue light began forming into his palm. Gran Rey Zero! He yelled before erupting, launching the beam. She had underestimated the power, and could feel its force as the tower behind her had been blasted into pieces. She was blushing in excitement. This was someone she wished to annihilate with all she had. Be careful, Giselle still needs a part of him. Ichigo joked as he began distancing himself from the female. Grind! Pantera! Before Bambietta could curse Ichigo down for trying to intrude, she was surprised to see a massive burst of light blue Ryatsu. The person now had a serious and low gaze. His attire had now drastically changed into something much more dramatic. Grimmjow's blue hair had extended down to his waist along with his armor now covering his body from the chest down. The Stern Ritter only grinned in excitement as the person was emitting much higher levels of Ryatsu than before. Before Grimmjow could even expel his immense power, he was met with a similar force. Bambietta released her Voix, standing proudly. The light blue Ryatsu beamed into the sky and he could tell she was going to match him. Her swings sprung open and she flew high into the sky. The Espada tried using his immense speed to catch up but was furious to see how quick even she was. With one last grin, the Stern Ritter began releasing Hell upon Las Noches. She flew all around the night sky and yelled in bliss as Reisher orbs began colliding with the fortress. That poor castle. Hollows from far distances could witness massive explosions roaring through the world. The building could naturally heal itself, however, the explosions were so consistent and massive that they had nothing to heal from. She of course made sure to hit the more vital areas to ensure the walls would collapse onto themselves. Ecstasy ran through her body as the destruction was going into full effect. God damn it! Come here and fight! Grimmjow yelled. She turned her attention to him and begins unleashing a wave of circular orbs of Reisher. The Arrancar should have known by now that nothing can cut the orbs, and his own brutal strength to repel them was just not enough. He focused on speed and agility to try and get the upper hand, but the moment he could try and get close, bombs would encircle the girl. The Espada tried surprising by using his hidden misses which were placed in his arms. It took him a long time to realize her power was not that she could expel bombs, but rather turn objects into them. His Garra de la Pantera had been turned into smoke the moment they were shot from his body. This explains why his sword earlier had an explosion on it despite dodging it. Bitch! He yelled before charging her once more. The Explode only grinned and awaited his approach. Giselle Gawel was a wild card in the Wandenrake. She was one of the youngest Quincy to ever be promoted to a Stern Ritter position. At just age 14 she had already impressed Yawach, and had obtained a piece of his power. This power then was able to mold into what she is now. The zombie was a unique puppet controlling technique which allowed her to control every beating with a beating heart. Whether it was human, Shinigami, Hollow or even Quincy, she could do it all. But she always had to be careful. If someone was able to figure out what she could do before a fight, then things could go very wrong for her. She was a master at psychological confusion. being able to outwit anyone who would try to strike her. This would mainly work against light-hearted men, as either they were too humble to strike someone who appeared so innocent, or they were too upset to strike for being so good and looking in their eyes. However, if they could get past that issue, then things could get even dire for them. They had to be careful not to cut her and keep her alive. Depending on the person, they can easily fall victim. You still are following me, Seng-chan? I'm not your inferior. The man's eyes never left her body, only until he can't see us. The iron needed to be careful. There are prominent rumors about the female. They were defined as she had corpses hidden in her room, and that she often spends time with them. The more troubling thing is that some of these corpses were Quincy, and to be more specific, past Sternritter. These of course are mere rumors and no one had a shred of evidence supporting such claims. But some people were persistent. Some were always interested in knowing the truth and what the story was for Giselle Goel. Before she could respond, the two felt the presence of multiple figures leaping out from the side. The Quincy stares at the multiple Ehrenkar who for whatever reason all look the same. The iron only narrowed his eyes. Do your worst, I could care less about her. The zombie only watched as he began walking away. For whatever reason, the Ehrenkar didn't even bother attacking him. As if they knew his power was too great for them to chase. You're going to regret that, she giggled. Ichi-chan's going to be mad. She stuck her tongue out as he simply discarded her words. The Sternritter then turned back around to face the Ehrenkar. She widened her eyes as they began withdrawing their Zanpakuto. Wait! Don't hurt me, I don't even have a weapon! Giselle panicked as men with human skull-like helmets began ambushing her from above. These beings did not have voices, and only did as told. The moment they slashed Giselle, blood was splat onto them. Two of them struggled to move their limbs as their bodies froze. So mean! She yelled. The two beings known as Calaveras stabbed each other through the heart and collapsed onto the ground. More of them came, and Giselle followed the trail. She was led to the base of the east side wall where she widened her eyes in confusion as she met the source of the hollow. Soldiers, halt! Yelled a man with a bull-shaped skull mask. It was more of a mask since it covered his entire head. The man was idle in position. He seemed to be wrapped and held by purple branches which connected all over his body. She watched with curiosity as more and more Ehrenkar began forming from his limbs. What is your purpose here, enemy? He asked. Giselle tilted her head. You know, I think I just wanted some pet hollow. I saw a little puppy earlier, it was just the cutest little thing. Can you be my pet? The sparkle in her eyes was no joke. Rudborn simply ignored the comment and began throwing more soldiers towards Giselle. She smiled. These things barely have any reatsu in them. Just a few drops, and that will do it. The zombie bit her thumb. Giselle allowed small amounts of blood to be dripped into her palm. She purposely waits until the Ehrenkar stops making more hollow before releasing the red liquid onto the entire charging group. It covers a good portion of the Ehrenkar but failed to take all of them. What are you doing? Attack! The leader of the Exequias was shocked to see that around half of his spawned army was frozen in place. He watched with whatever expression was under his hollow mask as his Calaveras turned around and now faced him. Without a moment's hesitation, they had switched sides and began combating the non-controlled Calaveras. Kill them all, she said with absolute joy. The zombie leaped into the air and pulled out her spirit weapon. Rudborn had difficulty repelling arrows since his body could barely move while undergoing his resurrection. Giselle proceeded to then splatter more blood across more Calaveras until she herself had a small army. Oh! Is that a number 10 I see? She asks. Rudborn curses as the spawning Ehrenkar could no longer repel the controlled Calaveras. Ah, don't kill him, I like this power. Giselle watched as the Ehrenkar turned on their creator and began cutting down the branches. The Espada cursed and was forced to pull back his resurrection. Everything came oozing down into his gray Zanpakuto. He looked all around and concluded he was surrounded by his own men. Forgive me, Halibel-sama. Giselle appeared before Rudborn, who sat back facing the wall. In one last effort, the man gripped his blade and leaped towards the Quincy. It was almost hard to believe that he had actually pierced her stomach. At least you were smart enough not to celebrate, she whispered. The man felt his body being consumed as Giselle wrapped her arms around the man. Blood splattered across him. No longer could he feel his body. Everything soon faded from his eyes. One down, she said aloud as the Calaveras suddenly vanished. Time to even it up, said a voice from above. Giselle looked up and could see a figure standing at the high point of the wall. She was a female who had her hair in two pigtail and was wearing a slim, revealing uniform. She had purple eyes and a hollow mask covering her left eye. Her expression was surprising weary rather than arrogant. It appears the girl had seen the entire fight without bothering to assist Redborn. I already know your little trick, bitch. Giselle smirked and waited for the girl to leap down. That was fun. Ichigo stretched his arms before leaping onto his friend's bed. Bambietta shrugged and took over her jacket. It was bloody, I guess, she replied. He raised an eyebrow and gave her a sharp look. What? She asked with her sharp tone. Ichigo knew damn well she was lying. Seemed a bit more than bloody for you. He had seen the way she had gotten. The stern Ritter practically lost herself in pure ecstasy. It had been so long since she was able to unleash her full power. I forgot how strong I really was, she admitted with a cocky grin. Bambietta jumped onto the bed and tried pushing Ichigo over, but he would not budge. She huffed, "Fuck, I need a cigarette." That was better than sex. Since when does anyone here smoke? I wouldn't know about that, he replied. The explode merely scoffed him off. Just because you hang out with loose candy doesn't mean it sucks for everyone else. The scoff caused Ichigo to gasp and flinch back. He moved a bit further to the side as he was starting to get uncomfortable around her. Loose? What does that even mean? He seemed to truly be lost. Of course he understood the basis of what she was trying to say, but getting it all together was confusing. She punched his shoulder, causing him to curse in pain. Humph, don't lie to me, Kurosaki. Everyone knows you and Candy know each other on a cough-deep level. I find it unprofessional for you to even lay in here in my bed. It was difficult for Ichigo to process such a complex usage of words. He knew something was off due to her not expressing any emotion whatsoever. The teen had to be aware of his approach. Things could get dangerous real false, so I suggest you leave me be. What is this superiority complex? He snapped. No way. They're going to murder me out there. This is the only place where even Baz is scared to come to. She raised an eyebrow. The hell does that mean? And why would they be pissed of anyways? You know what it means. Ichigo sighed. They're going to be all pissed because I didn't pick any of them to come to Hueco Mundo with us. Now, she understood why he has been so distant with everyone recently. The moment they found out the intention for occupying the Hollow World was going to raise some red flags. The Quincy were too prideful to accept the assistance of the Arrancar. And so it was done in secret to keep distress down. However, it would come out eventually, and since Ichigo was in charge of majority of the operation, he would be the one being yelled at for not inviting people to come fight with him. Everyone of course wanted to fight. That is why they are even in this army in the first place. So the moment they realized that Ichigo did not pick either of them is only infuriating. It was not every day they could be able to expel their grand power. Bambietta could realize now why Ichigo chose her and not one of his closer male friends. She soon felt a cocky grin form on her face as she leaps up and faced Ichigo with an amused expression. Is that little Ichigo I hear? His expression comes a bit red as the embarrassing memories begin to flood his mind. I've always been bigger than you. Shut up. Bambietta-sama, can you help me train? Bambietta-sama, do you want to eat with me? Bambietta-sama, do you want to hang out sometime? There were much more memories that she could recall. But she was too lost in her own strange humor to recollect any. Ichigo sat with his arms crossed and a pissed-off expression on his face. Whatever, he yells before jump off the bed and walking across the room. Everybody has a stage in their life which they look back on and wonder on why they did things the way they did. Ichigo of course just remembers being shut down and embarrassed by his past actions. While the Explode simply thought it was amusing for him to approach her in such a way. Ichigo pressed his hand on the doorknob but tilted his head as he heard a sudden pound on the object. He tried twisting the knob but was stunned to feel a massive force collide with him dead on. Bambietta watched with even more joy as her own door sprung open and had pushed Ichigo far back into the room. His body collided with the wall, soon falling onto the floor. Who the hell? Karakura Town. The small city was a humble settlement just west of Tokyo. It catered to a medium-sized community where majority of its citizens lived in the suburban areas outside the metropolitan center. This town had been gifted with its abnormal nature of having potent ryatsu. The citizens here all had a somewhat higher levels of Riryoku compared to most humans. This gave a haunting side effect of having hollows and spirits roaming around the town. Karen and Yuzu Kurosaki were no exception to this. While Yuzu had not yet developed any sights of her own, Karen had been fully exceptional when it came to seeing future enemies. The two, however, have both been aware of the existence even if they had not seen everything there is to know. The two lived together in a small home outside the main city. Together they both go to Karakura High School and have an average-styled life. They were no doubt close sisters, but their personalities often contradicted their twin identities. Karen was often seen as the older one with a more mature attitude compared to Yuzu, who was younger and more innocent. Karen was more calm, more stern and realistic. Almost like a tomboy in her own right, she had no problems fighting people who annoyed her. Not even her own father was above this principle. Karen-chan, wake up. No. Her eyes closed as hard as they could as she internally begged for the noise to stop. She tried pretending to be asleep but could not fool her sister, as she constantly began repeating her name. Karen-chan, someone's outside. She did not budge. Is it a hollow? The question caused Yuzu to frown. No, it's a person, but she looks different. Karen sighed. Don't be rude. She turned over and faced her sister. I bet she's harmless. The girl's eyes shuddered once more, but she could feel the anxiety come over sister. The black-haired female did not seem to care. It was a Saturday, and she had nothing to do for the entire day. Getting up this early for nothing would only be counterproductive from her desire of doing absolutely nothing. Yuzu bent down and got close. She whispered, I think she's a Shinigami. Karen snapped her black eyes open and stared with a surprised expression. Are you sure? She nodded. She has one of those swords on her hip. Karen now had gotten up and quickly got dressed. Where is Dad? She asked sternly. He's in the shower. Of course. Karen quickly went into her own bathroom and began getting ready. The two have had very minimal experiences meeting Shinigami, but when they did it was always a big deal. Their father enjoyed telling them stories about his past days as a fighter, and how he was one of the strongest captains in the Godai 13. The more mature sister had a sharper interest in these matters since she often could see hollows wandering around the city. It didn't take long for her to quickly run down the stairs. She immediately opened the door and was greeted with a blank white sheet. Karen flinched back and slowly traced her body up. Her eyes locked onto the uniform and was quick to catch on to a green-hilted blade. Karen was forced to step a bit back as she could not see past the clear woman's large chest. Her gaze widens as she can see now the sea-green-colored hair and her hazel eyes. The woman gasped, Huh. You must be Karen, she yelled in delight. Before the young girl could answer, she felt the powerful arms of the women wrap around her. Karen struggled to breathe as the person had sprung into a powerful hug. And you must be Yuzu. She was able to gain one breath of fresh air before being nearly strangled into another hug. Yuzu tried squirming but was too weak to make a notice. Eventually the Shinigami released the two. Oh, I'm so sorry. I forget my strength sometimes. Don't touch me. Karen eyed her suspiciously. Sometimes, huh? The need for air soon diminished as she was able to catch herself up. Yuzu forced a smile. What are you doing here, Shinigami-san? The older woman laughed. Oh, I'm not a Shinigami. And I'm here to talk to your dad. They could only guess as to why such a defined woman would bother looking for their dad of all people. Before the two could question the girl, her eye lit up as a sound approaches from behind. Karen! Did you take my boxers again? Kurosaki Ishin rushed down the stairs and scattered the area. He began throwing pillows around while also destroying the rest of the living room. Karen angrily snapped him by his ear and began dragging him to the door. Ow! Ow! Stop, Karen! The teen kicked him to the floor and watched as he struggled to get up. How could you hurt your poor father like that? He stood up and faced outside the door. Ishin widened his eyes in surprise as he eyes the busted female. And Nell, the Shinigami could not utter even a single word as a massive body sent him into the ground. Ishin! 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 The man struggled to comprehend what had occurred. His natural reactions could not even come up as the girl had leaped at unmatched speeds. Ishin noticed his daughters suspiciously keeping an eye on him as they wondered what he would try to do this in a situation like this. Help me. Karen wondered if she really should. She knows he doesn't really deserve it, but then again he may enjoy being smothered by the women. She sighed. Help me, Yuzu. Karen ordered. The two combined with their father's strength were able to slowly pry Nell off of Ishin. I'm sorry. It's been so long since I seen you. You look so different. The two looked to their father for an explanation. I'll tell you later. Ishin began pushing back Nell towards the door. I'll be back, he yelled before closing the door. The female still clutched onto him as he began walking outside. She had never been to Karakura town before and seemed to have forgotten the real reason why she was searching for the Shinigami. The man had been crucial during the Winter War and had a long history with the Arankar. The two traveled together towards a more secluded and private area away from the homes. So those were Karen and Yuzu. They were so cute. Ishin smiled. Yeah, they are becoming too cute for their age. Only a matter of time. His sigh caused the hollow to giggle. Everyone grows up sometime, Ishin. He nodded. Anything wrong, Nell? You sort of came unexpected. The errand car opened her mouth but soon widened her eyes. She started becoming a bit red as she tilts her head in confusion. Ishin laughed. Did you forget Nell? She stopped her thoughts as she could read his warm smile. The espada didn't have the best memory, but if anything she knew it was crucial. I came to see you. Now she remembers. It certainly sounds like something she would want to. Ishin laughed once more. Well, I'm here. Thanks for watching this video. If you really enjoy this video, like, subscribe, and comment down below, and turn on that bell notification. Don't forget to support and follow the Relo for writing that awesome fanfic, and also make sure to comment on this story, link in the description. See you in the next video. Goodbye.